Okay, I want to thank everybody for coming this evening to the joint special meeting with the Human Services Commission. And before I forget, I want to remind everybody to please use their microphones or you will not be heard overhead. This is 6:30 p.m. Tuesday, February 11th, 2020. And I want to call to order, and would you do the roll call?
I will. Mayor Karen Moran.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Christy Malchow.
Present.
Councilmember Ken Gamblin.
Here.
Councilmember Jason Ritchie. Councilmember Chris Ross.
Present.
Councilmember Pamela Stewart.
Here.
Councilmember Kent Treen.
Present.
Councilmember Ritchie is going to be late tonight. He is at a function for his son. And Councilmember Ross, could you lead us for the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
First up is the approval of the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? Having a first and a second. Calling, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? 6-0. And next is public comment. Public comments. This is a time for, cheaters. This is time for public to address the council for a 3-minute limit per person or 5 minutes if representing an official position of a recognized community organization. If you would like to show a video or PowerPoint, it must be submitted or emailed by 5 p.m. the end of the business day to the city clerk, Melanie Anderson, M. Anderson, at sammamish.us. Please be aware that council meetings are videotaped and available to the public. Thanks. I have only one person signed up, and I apologize for my voice early on, which may disappear. Sherry Valderrama.
I can try to, oh, okay, great, thank you. Hi, I'm Sherry Valderrama, and I'm speaking tonight on behalf of my husband, Ramiro Valderrama, who is on a business trip internationally. So I will read his comments to you. He says, I am deeply troubled seeing item 4.1.3, which proposes a change to the way that items may be added to the finalized council meeting agenda. The proposed change states, accepted, an item may be placed on the preliminary agenda for a regular business council meeting prior to the approval of the agenda after the preliminary agenda is finalized, only if a council member or the city manager explains the necessity for placing the item on the agenda and receives a majority vote of the council to do so. Items may not be added to the agenda after the agenda has been approved at the meeting. My concern is that this change to the rules will have the impact of silencing the voices of the minority council members, making it impossible for them to raise discussion on topics of interest to them and constituents. This proposed change would, in effect, restore the same council rule that prevented any discussion of any topic that the majority council did not want the citizens to hear. In 2016, council members Christy Malchow, Tom Hornish, and I argued successfully against this rule because as a minority, we were being blocked out from the decision-setting procedures and in placing items for discussion that had been raised to us by our constituents. Then Mayor Gerend joined us in revoking this rule because the requirement of placing the item on the agenda requiring a majority of vote of the council to do so violates the state's Open Public Meetings Act of having a quorum deciding in advance the items concerning the city, not in public hearings, as the citizens have a right to transparently see what is taking place in their government. The council owes it to the city that all council members and in turn their constituents are heard. For this reason, the rules were made that in public hearings, any council member can make a motion to add or discuss issues, and if another council member agrees that such a discussion is merited, the discussion can proceed. Given that the rules were strengthened by the 2016 council to permit all council members to have the opportunity to interject ideas and differing opinions, reflecting the broader Sammamish community, one has to question why, in the majority, these now draconian rules that violate state OPMA laws are again being considered. The impact of this change would mean that our citizens would only hear the issues the majority wants them to hear, and the minority council members and their constituents lose their voice. This is not the way forward to support the transparency and the democratic process that our citizens deserve. Thank you.
Is there anybody else who would like to address the council?
Hello, my name's Mary Wichter, and I live at 408 208th Avenue, Northeast in Sammamish. I did email City Council and staff earlier today. I'm not going to go over it, but just clapping is not always disruptive and sometimes needed. On the voting, I want to make sure you're not just taking control, but giving input and letting commissions do their work. Maybe I have understood, but it sounds like the word commission might be deleted from one of the sections. I also think there should be a finance, legislative, and utility committee that actually works and meets, because I think those are super essential. More would be fine, but that's a minimum, particularly the utility one. And then also, if you're not having a meeting, maybe you need to add an extra study session every now and then, and office hours are greatly appreciated. So the second thing I handed out to council members I wanted to talk about is, I guess it's a human service. It's kind of a crappy topic, and that's septic systems. In the city of Sammamish, we have about 3,500. That's about 17% of all the parcels, and the other cities around us have 5%, 4% or lower. We're not going to get anything done with it unless we do something about it, and I do believe there's legislation that can be done. For example, in Issaquah, I know they were looking at septics, and Issaquah does not have a rule that if you live within 200 feet of a sewer system, that when your septic is failing, you have to connect to it. We do have that in the city, which is good, but we need to be able to get to there. So if you've got a place where there's smells or septics, if you're not able to test water or deal with stormwater or say that it's not a stormwater problem, you can actually get those attachments made. So I believe there are things that need to get done. These could get done under Utilities Committee. And I just wanted to say there are 3 wet utilities. There's water, and you need to protect that and not destroy our aquifers. There is pollution in Issaquah, which is costing a lot of money. Sewer, we need that anywhere and everywhere it can be, and you have to have a conversion for the people that are going eventually. And if you don't, I know that fecal coliform is rising in Pine and Beaver Lakes and also in Lake Sammamish. The phosphorus does seem stable, and a lot of the septic systems are around those lakes or in the steep slope areas. And then the third wet utility is stormwater, and that's what the city's in charge of. And if you're not doing stormwater, you will impact water quality, you will impact working septic systems, and if there's not a sewer in place, the people can't do anything to fix it because you really can't fix your system on some of the small older lots. So I think we really need to have this as discussions. You need to do something about it. The data here was counted by King County in February of 2018, so that's 2 years ago. I'm not aware that the city's done anything to work on that. I think it should be one of the topics and that you do something about this year. So this is a reminder. Mark Cross's name is on here because he'd actually told you that the February that we had all that snow, that big slush actually put a lot of fecal coliform into Zaccoose Creek. So here's some history. I'd like to see some action from council and work done on it this year. Thank you.
Is there anybody else who would like to address the council? Okay, seeing none. Moving on, we've got our joint meeting with the Human Services Commission. And my voice is going to give out on me, so I'm going to turn it to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tom Ehlers. I'm chair of the Human Services Commission for a couple years, and I have some just opening comments. I'm told actually
go.
Thank you very much. So, Tom Ehlers, I've been chairing the Human Services Commission for a couple of years, and I'm going to provide just some brief opening comments, and then we'll actually dig right in. I know when you look at the presentation and the PowerPoints, you might say, oh my goodness, that's long, and it's going to take a while. Well, I'm here to tell you our commission kind of lives by the mantra, be brief, be bright, be gone. So we will be going through the things we think are most important for you to hear, but we won't be overdoing it, and we won't be reviewing things that we know you've already read, like the Human Services Needs Assessment, et cetera. The outline flow will be, I have some opening comments, and then actually we'll jump right into each of the needs. Nishima will be talking about mental wellness. When that is completed, we'll actually review with you our recommendation that's been sent forward. Once that section is complete, we'll then finish through the rest of the needs assessment. So that will be the flow for the evening. I'll be leading the commission in the discussion of the recommendation we sent forward. So for us tonight, this is actually the very first time we've had the commission and council together. Even though we've gone through task forces, we've been up and running as a commission. You have nicely supported our recommendations the last several years when we've made them. But for me and for us tonight is about sharing our learning. It's about communicating the why behind our recommended priorities. We have been living this for a long time. You guys have been in the community, of course, but we've got some knowledge and some depth that we look forward to sharing with you. And then, of course, we'll be reviewing our specific mental wellness recommendation. Success is asking you to take it all in, for us to communicate clearly and directly, for both really to build a sense of collaboration and talk about next steps. And of course, we're asking for a mental wellness recommendation to be supported. And then just speaking personally, I can tell you that when you start to talk about these items and issues, it's hard. So tonight actually could be hard when you start reflecting on what's happening with your neighbors. We know people around us. You often don't know who they are. Some are wrestling with domestic violence in the home, and no one knows it, and they don't quite know where to do. Some have a youth that are struggling with mental wellness and are in a crisis mode, and they actually don't know where to turn for help. Some have kids that are actually hungry tonight, and we have ways of helping them, but we know that sometimes they don't reach out. And there are other things. Cultural inclusion, we're blessed to have a growing culture within us, but on the other hand, it can sometimes feel very siloed. So that's really hard because these are our neighbors that we see at Safeway, we drive by, but they are struggling, and we have always thought the role of the Human Services Commission is to help bring their situation to light. Our collective job is to find ways to provide them relief. We know that we'll be bringing some deeper knowledge for you, but I'll close with an observation. All of us, and in a second you'll see our collective experiences, all of us have our own lived experiences, right? And as time marches on, it turns out you have a lot of experiences. What we've done is taken those experiences and gone deeper as a commission. So we've talked to panel experts, about 20 of them. We've read through deeply the grants that we have then made proposals to you. And through that, we feel like we've developed knowledge and expertise. We want to share that with you, but it really does start with the experience we all have. But we feel like we've been lucky in a way and blessed to have the opportunity to learn more deeply. On the mental wellness recommendation, when we get there, we were challenged because we have 150K, and when we went out and did the RFPs, the requests were very good requests for $400,000. So the question is, how do you wrestle with that? And we'll talk about our recommendations. So with that, as kind of a setup for the opening comments, we're actually going to move through a couple of these slides. That is your Human Services Commission. Pretty good-looking group, if you ask me. One note, Larry Wright left us a couple months ago, and obviously we now have a new person joining us tomorrow night. And then Stan will be rejoining us, so we're thankful for that. I won't read this by any means, but even if you scan down, and this was in your packet, there's actually a pretty cool combination of experience, and that was done by the City Council. So we have always felt very blessed and lucky that we have that expertise that's been brought to bear as we discern on next steps in grants, et cetera. We started as a volunteer task force. We went into a commission. We've been working as a commission, and it's actually been quite a nice journey we've been on. And then That is basically our charter. It's everything from what should we be doing in human services to dealing with the grants. It starts with the grants, but it doesn't end with the grants. And we feel like we need to be the headlights out front for the council and the community, and that's the role we take very seriously. So you'll see us come to you with emerging issues, not unlike the mental wellness recommendation, as we become aware of things as we move forward. But this is right out of the charter that was used to create the commission. So with that as background, we're pleased to be here. We appreciate the time. Oh, and then the other thing is, we actually did do a needs assessment. You hopefully had a chance to read it. We went out and talked to a whole lot of people in the community in a whole lot of different ways. We came up with 5 basic priority areas, and they've actually held up pretty well. When you look at the needs that are in our community and when we start to make progress, it feels like we're working on the right things. There's also some nice overlap. So we're seeing actually, just in Joyce will talk in a little while about our success last week with the Senior Center. Well, seniors and cultural inclusion actually have a wonderful overlap. When we start working with IAWW and some of their members show up in a senior center, we're starting for the broad community. And there's a number of ways that these overlap. So working on one doesn't preclude working on another. But those have held up very nicely, and we're going to talk about each of them tonight. Highlights. This has been a great year of learning. It's actually a very cool thing when you have a chance to bring experts in and interview them. We were able to do that. We had about 20 experts come in from talking to us about teen mental wellness, seniors, basic needs, cultural inclusion. And it's humbling, actually, when you look at the needs in the work, but it also is invigorating when you think about the impact you can make just by getting started. And we feel we're more than getting started, that we're making some nice progress. So with that, if there are no questions, we're actually going to jump right into the first need, if it's okay. Are we okay to move forward? Okay, Nishina is going to, we'll pass that over there. I heard they were going to give us all clickers, but it would have been bad. Yeah, that, my goodness. Yes.
Thanks, Tom, for the background. And as Tom mentioned, we've been engaging with community partners over the last year. And on teen mental wellness, we spoke with a range of providers who provide treatment as well as prevention services, anywhere from awareness campaigns on teen mental wellness to direct service provision to creating resources and conducting trainings around teen mental wellness. And one thing that they told us overwhelmingly was that we should be thinking about teen mental wellness the way we think about physical wellness. There is such a stigma attached to mental health that very often teens who experience any challenges around this issue hesitate to reach out for help. So that was something really that came out in all our conversations. And you may have seen the slide that anxiety, depression, and suicide ideation is increasing consistently across as teens go through high school in our area. And this is really important to note because anxiety and depression lead to substance use and to increased suicide. And within Washington State, between the ages of 15 to 19, the leading cause of death is suicide. So we really have to pay attention to anxiety and depression in order to reduce suicide rates. And another statistic that's really critical that pertains to our area is that anxiety rates in our area are higher than state averages. And there are a number of factors that could be accounting for this. One factor that we have heard of quite a bit in our discussions with community providers and also based on the needs assessment is that we have a very affluent community, we have a large number of professionals, we have a multicultural community. And so the expectations around academic success and excelling in extracurricular activities are very, very high. And so teens feel very overburdened and stressed. They have told us that they don't have downtime, they don't have time to play. They feel overstructured. And then combined with that, there's an onslaught of social media as well. So, teens experience bullying. They experience body image issues. particularly young women, when it comes to social media, on many social media platforms, they see these idealized notions of beauty that they feel that they have to adhere to somehow. They also, get a lot of personal comments about their looks and appearance, etc. Which all these factors can combine to really exacerbate anxiety, depression, and other issues. So you can see, we have a quote here from our needs assessment that one of the teens that was surveyed as part of the needs assessment said that I feel more like a resume than as a person. We wanted to share some key takeaways based on the needs assessment and also the conversations that we've had with community providers. One thing that came up very strongly was that there's a need to increase access to key resources focused on mental wellness within the community. And these resources could be, a resource reference book that tells teens, who to contact where if they need any help or support. But we also need more mental health counselors, because not only do we have a dearth of mental health counselors, the counselors that we do have in many high schools, they spend a lot of time on administrative tasks. So they do not have as much time to spend on direct human interaction, providing direct one-on-one counseling to teens, which is concerning. And then, as Tom mentioned, our community is becoming much more multicultural. So we have many youth that are navigating two different cultures. They face a set of cultural expectations at school, a set of norms and expectations they think that they have to meet, and then they have a different set of expectations at home, and navigating that can be very challenging. And so culturally relevant counseling is really important. And then creating awareness is important for a number of reasons, because there's a stigma attached to mental health related health seeking. There's a need to create awareness about these issues. There's also a need to create awareness so that people will know who to reach out to for help. And then providing some direct messaging to youth, either by supporting peer-to-peer programs or by working with youth boards or youth clubs is really important, because youth often reach out to other youth when they're facing any crisis. And then finally, what we heard very clearly from our partners was that there's a need to use a multi-pronged approach. So at the individual level, providing that in-depth counseling and that direct support is important, but it's also important to provide training to youth so that they learn about self-care, about how they can improve mental wellness. At the interpersonal level, there's a need to engage parents and provide trainings around parenting skills. There's a need for providing information and training around how do you resolve conflicts, how do you build more healthy relationships. And then at the institutional level, in institutions or places where teens spend a lot of time, there's a need to create that broader environment that promotes mental wellness. So it's not, so I feel it's a collective responsibility, and we have to work with all the key institutions that support youth. So I would turn it over to other commissioners to add anything else that they heard in our discussions with community providers.
So we're going to move on into the actual recommendation discussion. And this is, again, one of the 5 needs. Could I possibly get the clicker back? It's like watching TV. You don't want to give it up. Thank you. So a couple overarching comments, and then we'll dig right in. We wanted to have some discussion. And as Nishina mentioned, the situation is a problem. It's getting worse. And I'm here to tell you that while We started this discussion a couple months ago when the tragedies in Skyline were experienced. And the reality is the situation has not changed. In fact, you may be aware, but there were two recent suicides in Redmond and Duval. And those are communities just like ours. I know we are here to talk about Sammamish, but this problem and this reality is far broader than just our city, but we are here to make some recommendations for Sammamish. Youth, and I can't underline this more strongly, 17% in the age range of ages or grades 10 through 12 have made plans for suicide. 1 out of 5. Okay, the next 5 kids you see, 1 of them have made a plan. The strain in our community is there's not enough capacity for them to actually get help quickly. Because when you're in that moment, what they say about suicide is, it's actually, crazy as it might sound, a snap decision. So what you want are youth that have a chance to talk to other youth that are knowledgeable, talk to counselors. Even if it's a discussion to make a plan, you need to talk to somebody immediately. Youth don't have adequate access to therapy. When we went out and we did the RFPs, we got a lot of good RFPs. There was a lot of good community input. We can't afford them all. And so our recommendation is, as we'll walk through in just a second, we did resist, by the way, when we think about our recommendation, we resisted the urge to mix and match. It's kind of fun in a way, and it's kind of human nature to take a chunk of one and put it with the other. But we actually scored, and I'll walk through how we graded it quickly, but we realized that these RFPs and programs stand on their own. The 3 that we are recommending to you actually complement each other really well. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But the other thing not to miss is that by City of Sammamish putting in investment and taking action, we're actually shedding a light on an issue that is often put aside and forgotten about. And if, as a society, we could only say, hey, it's okay if you need mental wellness counseling. Guess what? We all do in some way, shape, or form. So by doing this, by taking this action, we're actually putting a strong light, which is powerful. In terms of comments and themes that informed our discussions, Nishina touched on this a little bit. Scarcity, there's not enough counselors out there. Schools, I'm going to talk in a second how our proposals actually do touch on the schools. And we had a couple good school RFPs. We went with the ones that we thought were the strongest. Urgency, I can't underscore the idea that now is the time. As I mentioned, RFPs, we actually put 36 requests out to 36 separate groups, and we got 10 back. So it gives you a sense of when you guys challenge us, you challenge us to go broader, and we did that. Awareness, it's critical that people know where to turn. And then finally, I'm fond of the following equation, which is strategy equals discipline and sacrifice. Strategy is developed with discipline and sacrifice. You can't have everything, but by having that discipline, you can actually make an impact on the most important things. So that's kind of how we went about it. Moving into the...
Tom, can I ask
yes,
a question, though, please?
Absolutely. I was glad that was on, because I was on a roll.
So one of the things you mentioned was there aren't enough counselors out there.
Yes.
Why? There is a demand. Is there a supply issue with the counselors themselves, or why is there a deficit?
In talking to a range of people, it's a great question, because I almost can't believe it, right? I mean, why wouldn't there be supply and demand? On the plateau, one, the issue can be who's going to pay for this? And certain types of insurance companies only pay for certain types of care. Some are better than others, but the more typical insurance companies actually don't cover all that much. The recommendation we're going to make tonight is actually broadly encompassing, meaning there'll never be a kid turned away because they don't have the money or they don't have the insurance. I'll talk about that in a second. 2, the plateau just has a limit to how much. There are about 4 major counseling groups, and if you called any one of them and said, I have an issue, I need to get in to see you tomorrow, unless it was so crisis, you probably would have to wait a couple weeks, and I've pushed on that. So I'm not sure why, except the truth is there really is scarcity.
Okay. I think it would be helpful to understand that need a little better. I mean, I think just in terms of there's obviously a demand. If someone's in crisis, we want them to be able to get in right away, but not having the bandwidth with the 4 groups that we have here. I guess the question I have stands, and maybe it's something you guys can look into at a future time, is it because counselors themselves are hard to get, similar to nurses, right? Nurses sometimes can be hard for hospitals to get. I'm just curious if that is the issue, or if it's some other constraint, like you mentioned, with who's going to pay for this.
And thank you for that, because one big problem is counselors are scarce. The YMCA, we actually funded some of the YMCA to go get a therapist a year ago, and they can't find that person. They're scarce. It's a supply and demand thing on that side too. And for us, as we went into this, we said, what can we do to make an impact? And I think it's a great question. What will it take to bring more counseling capacity? But we realize that we can't solve that now, but what we can do is help by getting someone here right now. The recommendation for the therapist is actually someone who would report to a fully certified trained therapist. There's a whole learning you have to go through, and you have to have a couple years in experience. So the way that would work is this is a fully qualified person, but needs some years in the saddle, and that's why we can get someone who would actually do the job that we're recommending. The YMCA cannot find therapists, so I think that's largely it. And I think it's a fair point. What would it take to get more? And I don't know, commissioners or anyone, if you have anything to add from your own experiences, or Rita, who knows everything. So in terms of criteria, so what we did was the council budgeted $150,000 to address youth mental health. I mentioned we went out and we led an RFP request to a very wide range. It's very comprehensive. I have the list here, but it's who you'd expect to be on that list and then some, and we received 10 proposals. Once you get the proposals, the question is how are you actually going to evaluate this, and what are you going to do that's fair and measured? And we actually created a scorecard that we worked as commissioners to develop, and we had the 5 criteria you see in front of you. Accessibility and logistics: can they actually do it, and can somebody get to them? Can they actually implement? How would that look? Do they have clear sense of outcomes? What are their qualifications? Turns out a lot of people will tell you they're in this space, but very few actually have the true qualifications. And also, and then finally, cost and budget is an efficient spend of the city's resources. Oops. We actually had some spirited debate on the best way to spend this. But what was nice, our first cut of the scorecard, actually, the ones that you see that were recommended actually did rise to the top. The problem was we did not want to come back and ask for more money, so we had to make some decisions on where we could cut even the ones that we are recommending. But we had some good discussion, and we actually came to a unanimous recommendation for the proposal that you have in front of you. And what I'm going to do is quickly walk through each of them. We wrestled with how much information do you need or want, and also so you have the actual proposal. But what I thought I would do is quickly walk through the 3 and tell you why we landed on this. If it's more convenient, we can talk about each one as we go along. So with that, the first one, I'm sure many of you maybe all realize or know that CrossPath is actually a partnership built through Youth Eastside Service and Friends of Youth, unique to the city of Sammamish. In fact, the city of Sammamish funds the building over there, and CrossPath takes care of the interior. So it's a unique situation which actually responded to lack of therapy available here on the plateau. Their proposal, they actually proposed 2, and after some discernment, we went with just 1 because we couldn't afford both. But basically, they're adding a full-time equivalent, master's level, duly certified therapist. Duly certified means you're competent in both mental health and substance abuse. Turns out they're discrete, but they also have some overlap, as you'd imagine, so it's very helpful. They will provide screenings and assessments. They actually will go into the schools. The good news is that CrossPath has excellent school relationships as well. So there's this kind of warm handshake between a counselor in the school and CrossPath. But here's a really, really key thing. They actually are setting up a walk-in capability where because it's scarce resources on the plateau for therapists, they will actually have this person where anyone could walk in and get an immediate counseling session and an evaluation, and then they would schedule you. And that actually is not available. And the way the law works is a teen could walk in and do that on their own legally. So this is the first time we'll have that capability there. I could go on, but I'm sure you guys read the proposal, but it really does directly address the need that we have come to understand. And honestly, we'll learn from it. We'll look at the outcomes and we'll monitor it closely. Before we move to the next one, is there anything on that particular one that's?
Yes, tent cards.
Okay, so we have
Oh,
Deputy
okay.
Mayor, and then we have got
Yeah,
Councilmember Stewart.
phenomenal.
So as I read the CrossPath, which is both Youth East Side Services as the lead on that particular proposal, is that we're not going to get the 1.0 FTE with $86,302. Correct me if I'm incorrect, but when I look at their program expenses, the personnel cost for the master's level is $130,895. Did I read that wrong? Their total proposal, or ask, I should say, was the 150. But the personnel cost for the 1.0 FTE was 130,895.
So I'm actually going to look to Rita to clarify on that.
That's for 2 therapists.
The 130,895 is for 2.
Yes.
Okay.
So we went back to them when we looked at the 2, we couldn't afford it. We made a decision on which was higher value add, and it was the therapist. And then we actually pushed them, in all honesty. We tried to negotiate. But they have a certain standard amount they have to charge, and that's what the higher value add therapist actually does cost. Okay? Pam.
Yeah. First, I just want to say that I am always impressed with you guys at how you have compassion and empathy, and then you have this ability to dive down and really dissect the issues, and then to establish criteria to evaluate these proposals and make decisions. It's been my experience that those are generally distinct skill sets that people don't always have together. So I just really want to applaud you on not just this one, but in past work that you guys have done. So thank you for that. You've said a number of times that we have these needs. Does this fill all of the needs, or are there still more needs out there? I know that you said, we only allocated $150,000, but if we have children in crisis that have a suicide plan and we're not addressing those needs, I'd like to know if there's a gap, and if so, how much of a gap?
I would have to say there's no way one additional therapist on the plateau addresses the strain of 20% of our kids. But what we did want to do is take action and make capacity available to learn from it. And along the way, we certainly can do a capacity analysis for the needs of our community. But we also were beholden to what we thought the best use of the 150 was.
Yep.
The way the CrossPath Youth Eastside Service was written is they actually had a sort of a senior level and junior level, and they're going to be able to give us a little bit of both through there. But we actually, the CrossPath one rated number 1 across the board, and we wanted to cover both of them. I would say, though, before we throw gobs of money at it, let's get some experience. Let's see what this therapist does. Let's learn from it. And along the way, we can do an analysis that says, how much do we really need here?
Yeah, I would love to know from the various, whether it be from the schools and like CrossPath, how many people are contacting them and having to wait, and do they have an estimate of what additional capacity would be needed to fill that? Because I went to a couple of events with Youth Eastside Services, and they talked a lot about when a youth is in crisis and a youth shows up for a counselor, if they don't get to talk to someone, they often don't come back. So if we don't have someone to help them in that moment, they aren't necessarily going to work up the courage or be in a moment where they'll actually come back. And I think that is a huge opportunity lost. And I agree we shouldn't spend gobs of money, but I think that $150,000 in this community is hardly gobs of money if we're talking about potentially saving children's lives. The other thing,
Let-
I just wanted to really reiterate what you just said, because it's really important to think about what I was saying earlier about using a multi-pronged approach. So the second proposal we have around crisis connections is that they have a helpline and an active real-time texting service.
Okay.
So where you cannot provide direct one-on-one support, at least having those resources and advertising them so that teens have someone they can reach out to, because you're absolutely right. If they don't receive those services, they're not likely to reach out again. So having various options, I feel, and like publicizing other helpline and text messaging services, etc., might also be helpful.
That's excellent. And then the other thing that I wanted to know, you talked a little bit about insurance and why it's important that we have that we fund some of these counselors, because a lot of insurance doesn't cover counseling or certain types of counseling. And I think you touched on it, that with these counselors that teens could come in and get service without necessarily having to first reach out to their parents and get their insurance information. And it's not that I want to encourage anything to happen behind a parent's back, but if I'm having a crisis and I don't feel comfortable going to my parents, I think it's important that we have somebody there for them. Or, God forbid, the crisis cause is their parents. It's important, I think, to be able to have that. So I think this provides that.
Yes, so I actually spoke today with CrossPath just to go deep into this, and we've had a lot of discernment on already. But I asked the insurance question. The question is the city of Sammamish funding a head count that they're then going to turn around and get money for? I mean, what's up with that, right? And that's not actually it at all. This particular position would report to the head of CrossPath, but given their certification level, while they're fully capable, you actually can't charge insurance for their level, one. Two, the way CrossPath sets it up is, for those who can't afford to pay, there'd be a sliding scale of from 40 all the way down to 0, you can't pay, and all of a sudden that full-time equivalent looks like a pretty good deal, because they're able to see a lot of people they normally wouldn't.
That's awesome. That's great.
And I don't want to suppose that I can speak any more depth than that, but that's the way they set it up, and it seems to me that's kind of the investment the city is making.
And then the other thing that I learned when I met with the Youth Eastside Services folks is that, we talked about the students being overly scheduled. It sounded like we need to make sure we have plenty of counselors available both in school during school hours as well as other hours, because there are some students who don't have time except for during school, and there are other students who are too terrified to miss class or don't want other people to know they're seeing a counselor that won't go see a counselor at school. So it's critical that we have both, is my understanding.
Yes, and the beauty of CrossPath is they can play it both ways. They will go to school.
Okay.
A lot of times the counselor at school is the first line of defense. Some kids do not want that deeper connection in school.
Right.
So you're after school, but this person's hours are highly flexible, so they can work when they need to work, basically.
That's terrific. Yeah, I guess when we get to another point, but I would like to figure out how we could, again, collect some of the metrics in terms of, are we meeting the needs? What might those other gaps be? And when we can get that back to council if there are gaps, because this just seems like, I almost can't imagine anything more important than providing this stuff for our youth in the community.
I think it's a fair question. What's the needed capacity? You may not like the answer as a collective community, but we should know that.
Absolutely.
Right? And then you can start working with public-private partnerships or even private to build that out. So
Absolutely.
I think that's a fair takeaway.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
So I got a quick question. I've heard several times quick and immediate response to crisis is most important. And my question is, it seems like our first two options, CrossPath is addressing that and Crisis Connections is addressing that. My question is the third provider we have here, India Association of Western Washington. It seems like it's not a crisis-oriented at all. Seems like it's more of a get-together on a weekly or monthly basis and
run a youth summit at some point, which again will all have value. I don't want to take that value away. My question is, if we're looking at crisis and addressing crisis and having staff and people available at schools, at middle schools, at high schools, at cross-path counseling, can you give us your rationale for taking money away for that crisis and rather putting it more toward a long-term program?
Sure. No, it's a very fair and great question. And commissioners jump in. So the thinking is that the best intervention and the most effective is early intervention. So what is happening is teens don't know where to turn, and they're under duress, and they carry this with them every day. So actually, an interaction with a therapist in the moment at a time when the teens are actually getting together can be very, very powerful, and it actually might avert a crisis. Remembering that, you know when a kid is about to kill themselves, one, either they tragically do it, or they go to their parents or friends, or they start acting out. That is an extreme crisis. Our objective here was to create a breadth of response so we could get to kids before they hit that almost point of no return. And what we liked about the IAWW was, one, we know them to be an organization that gets things done. They're actually extremely helpful on the senior center. We wouldn't be where we are without them. They get it done. They're reputable. And the notion of having kids engage as they set it up is, first of all, it's open to all cultures, not just Indian cultures, but also it's a great way of learning. Can we get ahead of this thing and start working with these kids before they get to that crisis point? So, yeah, you could take money from there and go and give it to CrossPath or whatever you might do. But from our perspective, it's a broader and deeper solution by doing work in each of these areas. Christy, did you?
Is that a second question?
Yep.
Okay, so then let's ask.
Dan,
Thanks.
you gonna ask me a question?
No, I won't ask you, I'll tell you. Another advantage with the association is they're not just dealing with the youth, it's family-oriented, so awareness to the family, and that's a big step in prevention, is to just let the family know, you may be the stressor on your child, addition to the school and everything else. And having a group situation, a lot of times we found out that youth will speak to youth before they'll speak to their family. And having that group environment, they have the opportunity to speak with each other as well.
And just to finish up, I was looking at the website for the IAWW. Do they currently have these mental health specialists on staff? Is this a current program with them that they're expanding, or is this a program they're instituting with this funding?
So I know they've actually had a youth program for 25 years. I'm going to look to Rita, who has been.
So they've started community conversations for the last 3 years around mental health within the community, and they've had a youth program for the last 28 years, and they have a partnership with NAMI as well. So, and they actually they actually have an Asian Indian behavioral specialist on board as well, or they're looking for one. So this is work that they were already engaged in. But they're obviously expanding it in this application.
And if so we're jumping through them. A couple of comments on the IAWW, and then we can. Christy, sorry.
I just have a question, because I know we didn't really give you an opportunity to talk about Crisis Connections or IAWW before we started in on the whole full meal deal here. So back to CrossPath, I do have an additional question based on the fact that the 130 is actually for 2. So when I go back and look at this, what I see is I'm trying to understand, what are we getting for $86,302? We're getting a 1.0 FTE. I mean, I'll be honest, when I do the math, 150 minus 30 minus 33,698 is 86,302. So are we actually going to get a 1.0 FTE? And if so, which one? Because there are 2 listed here. One is a 1.0 FTE behavioral health support specialist. The other is the dual certified one.
Yes.
Are we going to get the dual certified one for 86,302, are we going to simply get the behavioral health support
No,
specialist?
we're getting the higher added val behavioral duly certified therapist.
Thank you.
$86,000.
Okay. Thank you.
And we wrestled with the best one. We went with a higher value add, and we actually pushed them. We started out, if we trimmed a little from each of those for 150, can you get me there? And the truth is they could not. And you don't want to push to the point of you think you're getting something, but you're actually not. The key is we are getting a mental health therapist duly certified for the 86,000. Okay,
Is that therapist provided by, hired from the YES system? Is that who's
Yes,
going to actually provide that?
The way it works is CrossPath lives underneath YES and Friends of Youth, so it's actually hired through that.
Yeah, so it's a YES hire that we would be getting.
Here.
So
at
the
CrossPath.
other question I have then, I have, hi, Kent Treen. I work in a behavior program, Bellevue School
Figured you might have a thing or two to say.
and I work with YES daily. I do have a small concern as to, if they're double dip. I don't want them to be double dipping.
They're not.
Because they can dip from the school and then they could dip from us. So that would be a challenge for me as a council member, right? That if YES was going to the schools and getting money for this position and then also coming to us for the money from that position.
And the answer is we've pushed on that and we've clarified it. They are not. The reality is this position is going to provide incremental counseling to those that actually can't afford it, teens or those not on insurance. And I agree. I mean, I'm not wanting to use city money to fund something that either, and YES, as you probably know, has a fantastic reputation. This isn't about double dipping. We confirm that, and we understand the mechanism that this would be an incremental person and not.
And then on the CrossPath, this little hybrid they've got going here. If I'm not mistaken, the city, and you might have mentioned this already, though, we already are funding part of what they're doing already by
The city,
giving
as I
them free
understand
rent.
it, gives them the building,
Yeah,
basically.
they get the free rent, right?
And it's going to get torn down eventually, by the way. Yes, it is. So they're going to look for a home eventually.
So, I just want to put that on the record that, I mean, we are, as a city, providing more than what this 150,000 is not all that we're doing for the wellness of the youth in the city.
And my understanding is, and there are those who might be able to help, but the reason it was set up was because there truly was no available counseling here. And in the wisdom of whoever set it up, said we have got to align with them to bring them here and to keep costs down. My understanding is the city gave them that use of the building. They don't request any other funding through the grant process because they know that they are beneficiaries of that. So they don't, not double dip, but they don't ask for kind of a double take, if you will. And that's, by the way, the reason that it seemed to make sense to go to them, that they have they're situated here and they have the proven track record.
Right, the building is there, the place, the location,
Right.
people will know about it
All of
already.
that. All of
So
that.
you have some branding already pushing forward.
It's leveraging dollars that the city is already investing.
Thank you. Jody. Yeah, you should restate that.
And the question
So
I
we're
asked today,
leveraging
go ahead,
dollars.
Karen, sorry, any more?
The city's already spending.
Getting used to the cards.
Did you have a question? I actually did have a question.
Yes.
I had a question on when you count how many, when you say there's no counselors available in the area, does that mean there's, I've got friends that are counselors that live up here. So, and they have their own private businesses up here. They work out of, their home or whatever. Does that mean that, so when you say there's none available in the area, I'm trying to see what that means.
So here is, because I asked that question, like, okay, who's your competition? What's actually going on in the market? And come on, there's no counselors, right? There are 3 other large practicing groups, Centered Mind, Thrive, and Aviani, I'm not saying that correctly. So there's public groups. I don't know about private availability, but what I can tell you is that each one of them, including CrossPath, would tell you they're turning people away all the time or delaying, and that's part of the crisis point. We simply don't have the availability. And we'll learn more assuming we go forward with this, we'll learn more about that person and what they do.
And I'll just speak from personal experience that when one of my children needed counseling in recent years, we called maybe 5 to 7 private providers in this area, going down to Issaquah and Redmond, and they were not taking new patients. It was very difficult to find available who specialize in teen and youth issues. So
CrossPath today said they turned away 6 people last week. It's happening, and you know, we know that they are being forthright with that. So, yeah. I'm not wanting to overstep or whatever. Would it be helpful if we had quick blurbs on a little bit more on IWW and Crisis Connection? Would it be helpful just to review those? So I'll start with IWW since we've talked about that a little bit, and obviously everybody jump in. The IWW, the first time I read that, I said, well, gee, is that too narrow of a slice in our community? It turns out 30% of the students in the classes today in our school are Asian and Indian culture. And what I really liked about it was, that's one thing. 2, one of our needs is actually cultural inclusion. 3, we know that they will execute this program and they will communicate to us in good order because they've done it quite frequently over the last many years. And 4, it actually is a great test to see if this type of program makes an impact and can we learn and take it to a broader area. It turns out the most powerful thing really is kids talking to kids along with a counseling kind of oversight. Because every kid out there thinks they're strange and unusual until they get in a room with strange and unusual kids, right? That's what's missing in society today a little bit. And we love the idea that they will be able to bring that forward. Significant growing part of the community, open and scalable to a broader community, credible, competent organization. The other thing that actually, to double down on that a little bit though, is there is this notion of a bicultural walk with a group like that culture, because what happens is families move here and the kids have to navigate going to school and being part of that culture and then going home, and how do they actually, that's a strain that actually goes above and beyond what many kids do. So, you know, if you think kids are under stress, imagine navigating that. So we liked the idea that would be doubling down and focusing on that area, and for all the reasons I mentioned.
I just want to also add that kids of color also are not able to access, there may be, you know, there may be other therapists out there, but if they aren't from their other, they may not be providing culturally relevant or appropriate services so that the kids of color, when they go there, they don't feel comfortable. And if they don't feel comfortable, they're not going to stick with it. And so it's really important when you look at this, we really looked at, and Tom has talked about this, that it's a portfolio, right? It's a whole, we looked at this as a bigger puzzle pulling together pieces. And so we have cross-path counseling. Likely it's going to be a white Caucasian person who's going to serve many of our students here. And then we have Crisis Connection, that also mainstream organization, which is great because we have 50% of our population is white on the plateau, English speaking, but we still have a third of the population who are not foreign born, non-English speaking, or their family language may not be English. And if we don't provide some piece of the puzzle, I'm not saying all the puzzle, but some piece, and if you look at this, it's really only 30,000 out of 150 for a community of color, whereas the rest of it, so we're trying to reach a broad section of the community and not just one part of the community. And that's part of the whole portfolio idea in terms of our reach of community. The kids of color have additional strain, and then don't feel comfortable going to many of the resources that we have. So that was one piece of it, in addition to knowing all the things about IAWW, which we already know, and that they are not exclusive, right? They're not, it is in English, and they do serve many cultures, but they are culturally competent for kids of color, particularly the Indian community, which we have a significant amount of population. I think we have about 8,500 residents in Sammamish that are of Indian descent. So again, it's looking at the whole picture. And then when you look at the portfolio, we're having individual counseling, outreach using other types of methods, and then we're also having family group, community-based services. So we're, again, looking deep and wide instead of just like one mode that might only work for one section of the community. We're trying to make it have a variety that works for different kids who are from different backgrounds and different
And
ways.
the one other thing to add on IWW is it actually does go across school districts as well. So, and we carried with us how are we impacting schools and where does awareness come from, et cetera. And I know, Karen, we've talked about that a little bit. So that's IAWW. We think it's a great complement to what we're doing. And then finally, Crisis Connection is where you really do double down and make the impact in schools. They have the relationships, and here's what's really cool. The relationships that they need to strengthen or build, they can look to CrossPath and others to actually build that. So when you start looking at these three, it's more of a triangle than it's a stacked kind of thing. I've had discussions with CrossPath and YES about this. So the first point is that they actually would get into middle school and high school with suicide prevention trainings. Everyone, generally speaking, goes to, oh my goodness, a high school senior or junior is under duress. It turns out the actual better point of intervention is in middle school, early middle school, where kids are trying to find their way and find out who they are. If you don't have the resources, you wait to crisis as opposed to intervening early. They actually, one thing they'll do, I don't know if you all see it, it's actually available here in City Hall, but they actually make sure each kid has a booklet like this. Now, is a kid going to memorize it? Probably not. But what it does is it shows them somebody cares about them, and here's where you look for help. It's critical that kids have a chance to interact with each other along the way. They actually kind of, I don't know if they pioneered, but the whole texting teen under crisis, and because a teen texts, that's kind of what they do, right? You're not going to get on the phone, that's too intimidating. So they're strengthening that. And we just thought it was a really nice complement. They will put 0.5 FTE, not double dipping or anything, here in Sammamish. And what we can do is look to them and say, what impact have you made? Talk to the schools, show me the outcome and the impact. Because I'm, at my core, I'm a pretty numeric person, and I've got to see the impact on this stuff to know if we'd ever want to do it again, or what's the true benefit of it. So we felt like those three kind of complement each other. Anybody else have anything? Mr. Ross.
Good stuff. One thing that struck me is, one thing I look at when I look at service providers is the direct impact at the issue at hand. And the issue at hand is youth mental health. I look at, yes, CrossPath, and I see a direct service provided by a counselor that largely would be funded with our grant. So I think that's becomes a very good choice. Go to the next one, crisis, the same thing. It's a bridge. Then I go to the third one, and I look at it, and it looks like a lot of overhead. Program director, office expenses, maybe some consultant fees for $5,000, then supplies for $2,000. It makes me concerned that it's almost like we're helping them start a presence, which is not a bad thing. But you mentioned 30%, that's 27 to 30% of our demographic is Asian, but not all of that is Indian. And coming from a Chinese family, I'm cross-cultured in Chinese, they're not likely going to go to an Indian counseling center as a Chinese. So just classifying them, typecasting them Asian, all Asian hang out together. And see the same services, it gets pretty specialized and pretty siloed. So I'm wondering what the reach of that is as well. So I get very concerned about metrics and qualifications and how are we really going to help these children. And then I get to the point, I agree absolutely with the objective of this. It's cultural. And I think we need to think, how can we get multiculturalism rather than picking one culture? That's a lot of money to start with one culture. We have a diverse culture in Sammamish. So how do we get multicultural representative to help our youth more directly is my concern. And that's what I read off it, but please correct me where I'm being misled.
No, thank you. And I have some thoughts, but I'd look to my commissioners.
So first, I'm an executive director of a nonprofit and write lots of grants and do lots of budgeting. And I can tell you as from that side of it, being a grantee, it's very difficult to make a budget when funders just want to fund the direct service program and not realize that it takes, like I can't just have a direct service person without having an office for them a desk to sit at. And it's quite a struggle if all of the funders say, I will only fund the direct service piece and none of this, because it takes all of that to provide the service. So that's one thing. I know it's hard as stewards of funding. Then I sit on the commission and have to make these very hard decisions, and are looking at budgets and really we're combing through the budgets and trying to be as efficient as possible. So I do understand your perspective as stewards of taxpayer money, but I do want to say it's not really realistic for funders to ask providers to provide high quality services without realizing that there's other costs that go into providing a high quality service. So there's that on that question. And then the second question about IAWW, I would push back a little bit. I know of programs like the Chinese Information and Service Center that is based in Seattle in the ID, but has programs on the east side providing to Indian families, Eastern European families, Muslim families, even with the name Chinese Information and Service Center. And I believe it's the same for IAWW. I do think, as a person of color, an Asian person, that I would feel probably more comfortable for my child to go to IAWW, even though I don't come from a South Asian background, than to a program that might be more like the Y for mental health services. So I wouldn't say that it's the case that IAWW is solely focused only on Indian families. I know for sure that that their demographic, although there is a lot, they're very well rooted in that community, that they are open to others, and that other folks of other backgrounds do access their services. And I don't think that's uncommon. So that would just be my personal experience working in communities of color with organizations like this that have identified with a particular name. They start out, oftentimes they do start out like that, but as they get rooted in the community and their qualities of services are high, people recognize what they're providing, and they work with their partners in other communities, and they start talking to each other and referring to each other and getting to know. And with IAWW being around for so long, that's even more reason to believe that they have partnerships with many of the other communities out there. So,
and if I could put additional
Yep.
context, anybody? So building on that, the 30,000, IAWW actually was the one group that basically said, we're going to put in as much as you're putting in or close to it. So they have 27K in. The program director is actually the person that's overseeing the running of all of that activity. And in fact, we even wondered, they have 5,000 in to go out and get specialists as needed. We wondered, is that enough? But they are saying that it is. And then the 5,000 facility rental is literally for the Boys and Girls Club. So, you start looking at the numbers and you say, somebody's got to actually have oversight to do this particular program. And to Jody's point, if we want this to happen, we have to be willing to support the infrastructure to make it happen, is how we thought about that particular program. Any?
I mean, I just wanted to make this broader point that, based on what Chris was saying, I do feel ultimately like we should be aiming towards maybe helping support an organization that meets the range of needs that different immigrant communities might have, so that it's not just focused on a specific community, but a broad range of the immigrant communities. But currently, we don't have any such organization. The ultimate aim should be to have that more of an umbrella organization that can meet the needs of multiple immigrant communities that we have in Sammamish.
And I see Christie's. I think you got Pam first. Oh, Pam. Sorry. Thank you.
So I would agree. I think we definitely need to address as broad a range as possible. And I think, Jody, you touched on it, which is the last report I saw, our schools in Sammamish now are a majority minority. So more than 50% of our students in our schools are not Caucasian. So I think it's important. I think that we do have to start somewhere, and I think that's what I hear you guys saying. And I thought I heard you say, Tom, when you were describing this initially, that they do have programs beyond just in the Indian community.
Well, it's open to any.
Okay.
And I know, so here's how that could play out. One, any child could step in and participate. More likely, a friend groups start to form and they start to participate together. I think about my kids' friends when they were in high school. It became United Nations because that's just, which is really cool, by the way. That's what Sammamish is becoming. So it is not exclusive to that. And I can tell you that the IWW, from our experience, has been unbelievably welcoming to all. So I would see that playing out and thereby giving us some more of that cultural inclusion as well.
So I love the idea. I mean, we have to start somewhere, and we haven't given you a blank check. But again, maybe this is another one of those metrics that we can look to collect as we're understanding what needs are we serving, and are there still gaps. But this seems like a great start, and I would agree that my experience with my kids is the same thing, is that it is sort of the United Nations, and they do tend to stick together. And so hopefully we'll see that happen. But if we feel like there's not, and maybe we can also talk to the Influence the Choice to find out what other statistics they may be able to have. They have a lot of surveys that they do through the school districts to understand if there are additional needs there that we can look to start to fill in the future. So thank you for that. I think it's great. I think it's important that we do keep in mind that we need these preventative programs, and that we need to be looking beyond just programs to address what is now the minority. We need to address the majority.
Christy?
So first, I think it's important to circle back as to why we gave an additional $150,000 to the Health and Human Services Commission. We had already done our biennial budget, which included grant funding, which had already been doled out. Council decided to do an additional $150,000 last November in reaction to events that had transpired in our community, which included the death of 2 students here from fentanyl. The $150,000, at least through my lens, is for a crisis that we have right now. The IAWW, I think, is a wonderful program, and I think that their proposal is probably better placed during the typical biennial budget that we will be addressing, because I don't see this proposal as being prescriptive to the crisis at hand, at least not in its acute nature. So within the confines of their proposal is, what was the terminology? Homework assistance. That's not the goal behind the $150,000. I know that's just a small piece of it, and I had the same question relative to, is $5,000 enough? They're talking about a psychiatrist, which is a level of schooling which is much higher, that they would have there once a month. And for $5,000, I think you're getting very limited specialist help for our students. It's also all in a group setting, so it's not individual. Somebody who's in crisis is not going to go in a group setting. I think what they've proposed here is perfect for kind of a more preventative measure for future happenings. And I think, like I said, I think this proposal would be better suited during the biennial budget, to which we'll be dealing with this coming November as a city council. But considering the crisis that we have, I think we set out on this trying to figure out, well, what was it exactly that we wanted to get out of this? We wanted to find out what was out there. I think we got a great cross-section of proposals from our community that spanned school districts and organizations that can provide those services for us. But I would lean towards the top two as getting the funding, and I would almost go so far as to propose that we actually go over the $150,000 in funding that council gave, just so that we can get the 2 FTEs that CrossPath asked for and the 0.5 FTE. I know that goes against what Jody was saying, where we're just funding the direct service, but I think it gives, we're not doing anything but the direct service for CrossPath either with the 86,302 if it's just getting us an FTE. So I know there's conversations going on at the other end of the table here, but I think it's important that I think that would be my, and if you give it's 24,000, let me look at it. I've got my Excel spreadsheet going on over here. It's 24,821 to get the 0.5 FTE. It's 138.95, which is a total of 155,716, which is just, about $6,000 more than what we allocated, and that would be what I would support.
Okay, I'm not sure whether we were doing that tonight, but.
It says action.
Okay. We are. All right, so I think we were still doing questions at this point in time.
I didn't make a motion. I'm just saying what I would support.
I didn't hear a question in there. So.
I guess, again, I'm just going to reiterate. We asked you to do, we asked you last year to go out and take a look, and you came back and said, we can get you to, people from an acute nature. If we were really concerned about the acute crisis, we would have taken what you guys had proposed last year, and we would already have 2 counselors in their seats already helping. I think we asked you to go dig deeper. I think you've done that. I really appreciate that. I'm fine if we want to allocate more. I'd be happy if we had two counselors plus the halftime, plus have a little bit of prevention. I don't see why we wouldn't do the whole thing. Again, it's a small amount of money if we're talking about saving children's lives. But I don't think we should continue to spin and spin and spin. I think if we're worried about an acute crisis, we take action. We've asked you to go collect more information. From everything I've heard you say, we know that this is probably not going to meet all of our needs. We know that there's still going to be gaps, and you'll go get us more information and tell us specifically what those gaps are. So I'm a little confused, because if we were really worried about the acute nature, we would have taken action last, I think it was October, November, when we asked you guys to do this the first time, and you guys jumped into action. You went out and you did some research, and you came back and said, we can get you a couple of counselors in their seats, possibly by the holidays, if not right after the holidays. So,
and to build on that, though, so thank you for all the input. The truth is, we were wrestling with one approach would be to come back with CrossPath as outlined, and that would be within the 150. And then when we looked at each other, we said, but it's broader, and I can't underline enough the idea that crisis is a moment where I need a therapist and a counselor and I'm in trouble. But if you think about a pipeline or a path back, you need to take action and activate chances for youth to engage with each other well before that crisis. And that's what we felt really great about IAWW. If you ask me, if I'm asking for the order, I would love to be able to give CrossPath their 2 FTEs, because it's a really great tiered. And I would love to keep Crisis Connection and IAWW, and I'd like to come back to you. If we can get there, I'd like to come back to you in 6 months or whatever it is and say, here's the outcome, here's the implications, and here's, I don't think you're you're wasting money with IAWW, and I'm not saying anybody saying that is at all. You're saying, where's crisis? But I can tell you, if you have a kid in crisis, it's not too late, but it's getting there. And we need to do work in our community to pull back from that as well. And that's where Crisis Connection and IAWW can help. But I would love to be able to afford that plus the cross path. The chair, am I the chair? I don't know if I'm the chair. I recognize Stan.
Thank you. One thing that we were looking at is so many times we take a reactive approach when it comes to crisis. We decided we need to also look at taking a proactive approach and reaching out to youngsters when they're, not just when they're in crisis, but to increase their awareness when they're in middle school, when they're in groups. So to take a proactive approach, and the IAWW gives that proactive kind of feeling, not only with the youth, but also with the families and parents. And I was glad when I found out that they were all-inclusive. Get away from the name. They don't draw the line there. So that was a big plus. But I think we have to take a holistic approach. And that's what Jody was talking about, was the whole portfolio. And we were trying to cover all the areas with the requests that we had submitted to us. We put the process into place, and you have our recommendation from us. So thank you.
To conclude, and I'll then take sorry, Karen, go ahead.
Thank you for the cough drop. Okay, one, I want to thank you for taking the time to put this together. I did have some questions on the IWW, but your explanation actually answered a lot of that for me. One of the things that I was disappointed to not see on here, but I understand it now after listening to you, was to not see the Lake Washington Schools Foundation on there. Only because out of the short, on the other side of that, you'd see, 100 residents trained to work with youth in the community, and that's a big giveaway. And I hope that they'll put that back in for, the next funding. But I want to thank you guys, because I think that you guys did a great job. I think if we start adding this and adding that, then I'm afraid what we're going to do is then we're going to start doing this is my pet project, so let's add that one in, and this is kind of my pet project, so let's add that one in. I don't think that's the way we should be doing it. But I do want to thank you guys very much for doing a great job and taking the time to sort through all this information and meeting with everybody.
Thank you very much. And yes, Lake Washington was a strong number 4, and we discerned and we debated, and just I'll take my lead. I understand there's action, but will that be at the end, or what is the protocol? Are we supposed to pause here? Because we're ready to go on to the next 4, and they will not take this much time, I can tell you.
Yeah, I would think that that's going to happen when we get back up to the dais. So.
Okay. Thank you again for listening and for discerning and asking sincere questions, for sure. So moving along, we have 4 other needs, and what we're going to do is each commissioner is going to take these in order. Let's see. And basic needs is the first one up, and that is CJ. Do you want? Oh, we're going to stretch my legs here.
Well, basic needs is pretty straightforward. I don't know how much I need to tell you about it because it tells you what basic needs is. And we've looked at these, and we're looking at what's going to happen in the next phase when we get the next funding that's coming up here. I think that are the basic needs where they are now perfect? No, there are some loopholes in where they are. Some of the sheets that you got, you saw where there are unusual things where people didn't get quite what they needed in terms of care. We're looking at medical care. We've got food bank that's doing the things. We've got enough charities that are helping. So I don't think there's anything that really is special to add to what you already had been able to read. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
Do you want to blow through the slides just to see if there's any? questions?
I had a question on the food bank.
Yep, you're talking to the right guy.
So, oh God, cough drops working great. I'll buy some from you. Okay, so the question I had on the food bank was, I heard they were going to be possibly teaming up with EF&R to put something together down in Issaquah.
Yes.
So maybe you could tell us a little about that, just so we can try to get information, maybe.
Yeah, this almost seems like a plant. So I'm
That might be.
I'm the current chair of the food bank. So here's the thing. The food bank, as you might think about a food bank, is not just a food bank anymore. Over time, we've realized if someone has food insecurities, they have other things going on. And, you know, what we strive to do is deal with the whole person. And what that means is we now have a caseworker on staff, and we can find a way to help somebody out across their entire kind of spectrum of needs. But what you don't want to do is reinvent the wheel. You actually want to get people who are subject matter experts to complement what you're doing. And in Issaquah, as in Sammamish, there's a crying need for more space, so nonprofits can come in and do their thing for a period of time, but not have to own a space or buy a space. So the food bank is tapped out of space. We actually are using the at-work facility as well for incremental warehousing. And we've had some dialogue with Eastside Fire and Rescue. It turns out they need a headquarters, and there's two components down there. One's a headquarters, the other is a heavy maintenance thing. They're ready to move with the headquarters ASAP. When we walk in there, we see a really great building that needs some remodel, but we see a whole range of additional spaces that someone who might be teaching English as a second language could come in on Tuesday afternoon, and then someone who's associated with, you know, an employment agency might come in on Wednesday, that same space. So what we're trying to do with the food bank is grow because we need it, but then complement. Think of it as like a virtual together center. Worked very closely with Jeff Clark, who is phenomenal, by the way, and he actually was at our board meeting last month. And we're starting to build up a capital campaign. We're talking with the state, maybe get some money that way. So hopefully in the next year, you actually will see that really come to be. So I could go on, but I won't. The other thing I would say on this, well, CJ, sorry, was there anything else?
There's nothing very special about it. I mean, there's always little things where there's little tweaks and things aren't happening. If you looked at one of the pages that you received, they talk about the fact that the number of residents of Sammamish that don't see a doctor as regularly as other people see them. There's some dental lags in there. There's some female hygiene things that are in there, but that's going to come out as we get into the next granting, and so I don't see anything unusual in there. This top statement here came out of when we did our review of the whole city and paid for the work that was done there. And I don't think what you see here is what people have said. There are people in Sammamish that are very well off, and there are people in Sammamish that are not very well off. There's people that have adequate housing at an okay price. There's people that are don't have enough money for what they need to do.
One thing to enhance on that is, as CJ mentioned, there's a sense of everybody is wealthy and everything's good. But if you look at actually statistically, almost 2% of our population is at the poverty line. And then you look at what the way to evaluate that, it's usually 3x the poverty line before you are starting to move away from food and basic need insecurity. So literally there are 6,000 or 7,000 people here in Sammamish that deal with that every day. And because I'm involved with the food bank, I literally have delivered bags of groceries to people here who didn't have it for the weekend. Not that frequently, because a lot of times they'll go to the food bank. The food bank also has a mobile outreach. So if you know somebody who needs food, tell them to call me or Corey, because we will go to them. But it's a bigger number than you might think that struggles with this, and that's just food. The good news is, as CJ mentioned, we actually do support through the grant process a range of basic needs, the Issaquah Food Bank, HopeLink, et cetera. But it is something not to be taken for granted here.
I think in what we've done in this first period is we've gotten a hold of all the different groups that support Sammamish. And I think as we start into the next granting cycle, we're going to be able to see some of those and maneuver them a little bit for maybe a little better use.
Thank you. That last term you'll hear more about if you haven't already, wraparound services, that's about helping the whole person. So go ahead, Karen.
Do you match your numbers up to, sorry, do you match your numbers that you have in any way up to, percentages that the school district might have? I know that from working, I know that can't give you exact numbers for exact schools, but they can give you for the city of Sammamish. So, because I know I've seen, just in areas, of what used to be a number of kids getting, free and reduced lunch or, sunshine money or whatever they want to call it. Those number of kids has gone up, dramatically in some areas and in some schools.
So the answer is, regarding the food bank anyway, the answer is yes. I kept asking the question until finally we figured it out. But what we did was we said, let's look at free and reduced lunch, looks at the poverty rate, and looks like at a couple other drivers or metrics. And we actually did an analysis that said, as crazy as it might sound, the Issaquah Food Bank only is meeting 20% of the demand. So if we're wrong and we're only meeting 40% of the demand, that's still a heck of a lot of people. And then the question is, what are the barriers? Sometimes they don't want to show up. Sometimes they don't know about it. Sometimes it's pride or humility or whatever. So, and I was thinking about that same analysis, Pam, when you were talking about what is the need for therapy here. Because, you start one of those analyses and you're like, I don't know I don't know how to do this. But you start putting assumptions together and you start to hone in. So I could send that to you too. It's something we have. I'll do that on the basic needs side. Okay, Stan? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think we've looked at all the slides, I believe.
I think we are, and now we're going to cultural inclusion, which is one of the 5. You got a question, though? Oh, was it? Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Well, I'll ask at the end. I just have, going back to the last topic, so.
Okay,
I can ask
do you want to?
I can ask it now?
Sure.
Yeah, you did mention that CrossPath turned away 6 people just this last week. And my question is, do they have a referral network? I mean, waiting 2 weeks versus going to Bellevue or Issaquah or another East Side community would be far preferable. I guess in an absolute crisis, a parent would want to drive their child to Seattle or other areas.
Right.
Do we have that connectivity and referral? Is it something we can work on? Is it a potential improvement in the service to our community?
What I have understood is they're never going to say, too bad, so sad, I can't help you. What they usually will do is, one, all these groups work together. Nobody's making a whole lot of money on this thing, and they're all connecting and working together. So they will first check out anybody else on the plateau, but chances are they've already done that. But what they do is they refer to Redmond, Bellevue, other places. Issaquah is as stacked up as we are, actually. So they will never let somebody go without. And if there was a true crisis, literally, some of their job is dealing with suicidal ideation. They're not going to do nothing then. And I can get a more robust answer than that, but I know that they do referrals out.
No, thank you for that.
Sure. Okay, Stan.
All right, so my section deals with cultural inclusion. One of our study sessions that we had, these are the 3 that were able to show up. We did invite more, but unfortunately with scheduling and things like that, when you only offer one night, it gets a little rough. But we've continued to gather additional information in the community since then. So on this slide, it's a little bit, I would say, a little bit misleading because it doesn't include under the grandparents that come for extended stays. So the numbers are a little different. My neighbors are Chinese. Their parents come for about 6 months out of the year, and they speak very little English. There's very little to do in the community here, so they take a bus to Seattle because that's the only place they have any kind of community involvement. So as you can see, the numbers of foreign-born residents are increasing in Sammamish. with here, my bigger concern was if you see about a third don't speak English at home as their primary language. About 10% don't speak English well or even at all in some cases. And in a crisis situation, I hate to use the word crisis all the time, but if the son and the daughter are at work and grandmother and grandfather are in the house and they don't speak English and there's a fire, many don't speak English, obviously. They don't know where to call, who to talk to. If somebody does pick up the phone, they have problems communicating. And those little delays, those little things can cause a tragedy. That was a concern. That's something that I picked up through these groups that we were talking to. We already discussed the fact that our schools are really diverse, much more than they were in the past, and the numbers are going up. Here's some of the takeaways that we came up with. As you can see from the takeaways, breaking down barriers is probably one of the biggest things. A lot of cultures don't trust City Hall, don't trust government. We have to find a way to reach out to these communities. They don't trust the police because in their country, the police are corrupt. We have to find our night out is a big plus. We just have to find a way to get it more inclusive and break down those, like I said, break down those barriers. It helped to be able to make City Hall a little more welcoming. You know, a little welcome sign might help. And find a way to do newsletters and maybe
different
even work
languages. In different languages.
Yeah, and that includes newsletters, websites, to be able to translate to other languages too. Anything we can do to realize that we have these multicultural, and we're changing. We're not all vanilla in this city. So I think it's important to make sure that we look at the takeaways and see what we can do. Our commission is going to continue to work and figure out what we can do to help. And now,
You know, just one comment on the one comment. Yeah. I would say a high watermark and something we're all proud of is think about cultural inclusion, the July 4th. That is unbelievable.
It is.
It's kind of, we could do a couple more of those kinds of things. And the thing is, if you invite people, they will show up and you make them feel welcome, and we do that well. And that is just a powerful, and it says we can do this, right? We just have to create programming and take action.
well, I think the 4th of July should be once a month.
Yeah.
Have like the fourth month.
4th of February.
The 4th of whatever.
Okay, Joyce, what have you been doing, man, with seniors?
I think you've heard about seniors in our community. Interesting numbers here. But there's another 12% of our population that's between 50 and 59. We have a lot of seniors. We have a lot of, how do you measure isolation? How do you measure loneliness? We have many in the cultural areas here too that are in the grandparent stage. What do they do? Where can they go? How do you get there? The questions that we get from them are, how can I downsize? What can I afford? How do I move around? What's my transportation? What do I do? How do I understand this community ride? CJ and I had a good time over the last year of visiting senior centers around, speaking with Sound Generations in Seattle, talking about what we could do in this community that could start people getting together, fellowship, social, having fun. We couldn't develop a senior center like Issaquah or Bellevue or Redmond. We don't have a building. We don't have funding. We don't have permission to do this. But we do have a group of volunteers who have got together and made a 1 day a week, 2.5 hour Sammamish Senior Center. We had over 200 people come to our open house last week. We're meeting at the Boys and Girls Club. We can be there when the kids aren't there. We chose Wednesday because we'd only lose one Wednesday between now and the end of school, the April vacation week when the kids would be there. We don't know where we'll go in the summertime. We know that wherever we might be able to land, we need parking. We know that the activity level was phenomenal last week, the chair yoga. We know that Karen had fun with bingo. We had some history of Sammamish discussed. We had games. We had fun talking. I would say over a quarter of the population was not your old people white. We had colors there. We had a lot of people, and I'm so glad that the faith communities and I would say the survey that we had during the summer at Farmers Market identified what the seniors want. They want something to do. They want someplace to go. They want someplace to meet. And it felt so good. Tom has been leading as the facilitator of a very spirited, enthusiastic 14-member group who has been meeting weekly since November on putting this together. And we've had a lot of fun. We've had a lot of signage. We've had a lot of cooperation with getting the flyers out, the social media and all. We have discovered that this is really important in our community, and we'd like to do better. We'd like to go more. We're working also collaborating with Eastside Friends of Seniors for being able to identify people who will pass the background check on being drivers, to bring some of the folk who have identified that they can't get to the senior center. They don't understand the community ride program. I don't understand the community ride program. I know that I'm a half a mile away from the nearest bus stop, so the community ride can't get to me. So what do we do? What can we do for our seniors? I guess this is here we are, disabilities. Look what happens when we age.
I'm starting to feel that.
Yeah, I think we all are.
Tough, man.
So you see it. It's the mobility, it's the transportation, it's connectedness. We need programs. We need an ACE hardware.
Yes, we do.
Any questions? Come join us on Wednesday.
Yeah,
It's really
last
fun.
week was great.
This is a great group.
There you go, sir.
Can I comment on so I was there for the grand opening. It was great. I met a 97-year-old woman who was in a wheelchair. I met people from Singapore to England to Australia and got into deep conversations. And yeah, you live near me. I may stop by your house and have some tea sometime. I mean, that's what we need. We need that community. And it was a feel-good, but it was also a nice social event where people were able to sit and talk and win prizes at bingo. I think
There was wine for prizes at bingo.
okay, I think the fix was in.
There we go. This is my 30-column spreadsheet on the people who attended and filled out paperwork, so at least we know where they are and how to get to them. Believe it or not, I only had 11 bounce backs of over 150 emails that I put out. I can almost read everybody's. 53% of the people there identified before being between 70 and 79. 10% were over age 90. I mean, that's pretty amazing. It was 14 that were in the 80s. There were 22% that were in the 60s. Just the people who bothered to announce how many years they've lived in Sammamish, 2,290 years. That was an average of 21.6 years, but that went back to the 1940s and people being able to say that they have lived here. Pretty amazing. It's exciting. Think what more we could do. Fund us. Give us space. Give us a building. We've met with the developers. We've been to churches. We need someplace. Can we do better than 2.5 hours a week when they've got 60 hours a week going on in Issaquah and Redmond? This is embarrassing.
Karen, did you have?
Well, I just want to say you guys did a fantastic job. And the turnout there was excitement, and everybody, the feeling in that room was so charged, and and everybody was excited, and I got to meet two women in their 90s, brought by a woman who they were calling the youngin', who was in her 60s, and that were from where I grew up. I mean, they were within blocks of where, the house I grew up in. And so, and I have to bring tomorrow pictures of that area.
Oh, cool.
And so, yeah, it was just really a lot of fun. And so, yeah, I hope everybody goes. I'm all in. I mean, I just thought it was absolutely fantastic.
You even signed the volunteer form.
I did.
Thank you for that. Pam?
So I want to thank you guys. I actually had people reach out to me and tell me what a great event it was. So thank you. A couple of things that strike me. So you have these sort of key takeaways. I'm hoping that part of what you'll do this year is come back with taking these and come back with some more specific recommendations to the council of what needs to happen. Because I just did a quick math from your other chart, and we've got over 8,000 people 60 and over in the city. That's a lot. That's an eighth of our population. So that's nothing to sneeze at. The other thing that just popped into my head is if we've got 2,000, well, how many years was it?
2,290, and that's just the people who
You
put it
talked
down
to.
on the
That's right.
form.
I feel like there's a marriage that needs to happen between some of these folks and the schools. I feel like there's a writing project that needs to happen here where we get these.
Interview the seniors. too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I
We're
think
doing 2.5 hours, though.
I think we need to get these folks into our schools and see if we can't reach out to some of our writing teachers at every grade level. I mean, I would love to hear what a fourth grader had to write about interviewing one of these folks. I think it would be awesome. So just some ideas of other things we can do. I know exactly. I know you don't have a location, but maybe we could help people get into the schools and have some time there.
They also need fellowship among themselves, too.
Well, I also wanted to state that for 20 years we've been focusing on the youth in this community, which is, we've got a lot of youth. I mean, we've had more youth per capita. I know the whole spiel. But the senior citizens have been, paying for all of that. And so I think it's also about time that we turn around and say thank you a little bit, too.
I'm always looking for Stan, go ahead, sorry.
I'll be quick. I just want to clarify that I'd like to thank Joyce and CJ and Tom for being the volunteers to get this going. They're part of the Human Services Commission, but it's a volunteer group that's done it. It's not the commission. And it was a pleasure helping, and hopefully everybody can volunteer. Karen loves bingo, so I'm sure she'll be there every day.
There you go. She heard there was
She
one.
didn't win it, though. Oh, okay. But it is a group of volunteers that are making it happen. And it was just citizens realizing we got to do something for our seniors. And it was obvious with the turnout. And citizens who attended said, it's about damn time. Excuse my language, but that's what they said.
Did you have okay. And actually building with Stan, where I was going was always looking for what's the model and how can we replicate this. Here's what's really cool. So Human Services Commission did this work and said seniors are in need area. And then Joyce, in particular, CJ was involved, and a number of us have gone deep and said, what is the need? And we said, let's just put a stake in the ground and do this. And that can happen in the other need areas too. It doesn't have to be everything from the city. We will ask for things along the way to collaborate together, but there are volunteers. If something's called to you, the next one up is domestic violence, and that is, it's not as exciting as seniors, but yet it is such an underreported area that needs to be attended to. And the reality is we have plenty of volunteers-oriented folks in our community, so it doesn't have to be everything's funded or everything's done. We will ask for money for sure, and to Pam's point, transportation, et cetera. I also want to say thank you because I know you all use your networks to get the word out on that. But we will come back on all of these things and say, here's how we'd adjust or address the items we've talked about. So thank you for that. And truly, a number of you hopefully will be up for speaking to the seniors at some point, 10 to 12:30 every Wednesday.
Except
see you there.
April 8th.
Yes. And down the road, we're looking for an old building that we can fix up, and then it'll be the senior center. So if you drive by
Well,
something,
how
you
about
wonder
city
about,
chambers? I mean, could that be open in the summertime?
it's a pretty nice big
Yeah.
building. We can
The
talk about it.
parking is atrocious on Wednesdays here
No
in the
parking,
summertime.
and the parking's a drag. Yeah, like,
The parking is going to be a problem anywhere.
But-
Right now, we overfilled all of the space around Safeway, Great Clips, over the Presbyterian Church, and our own. It was amazing.
We'll keep working it. Those are solvable problems. So the last need, thank you, Joyce. The last need area is domestic violence that Jody's going to talk to us about.
Well, the passion in Joyce's voice when she talks about seniors in the senior center is amazing and really a hard act to follow. So I'll do my best, but I get great joy from listening to Joyce talk about the seniors. You can just hear the incredible passion in your voice. So thank you for your work on that. So domestic violence. We had LifeWire and King County Sexual Assault Resource Center come and speak to us. LifeWire is the organization on the east side, the primary organization on the east side providing services, domestic violence services. What we learned is that it's what we've already known. It's happening across every social, economic class, every ethnic group, every age group, and it's happening right here in Sammamish, even though we don't see it. The sad part again goes back to our youth. It starts. This behavior is starting younger and younger. Because of media and other reasons, we're seeing it in relationships between our youth as well. So domestic violence is a blanket term that we use for emotional, physical, sexual, and economic abuse as well. A lot of people don't realize it, and particularly in communities where there is economic resources, it can be used against the victim. So domestic violence is significantly underreported in Sammamish, and if you look at it, it can appear to folks that our rates are low compared to national rates of domestic violence, but we know through studies over many, many years that it's happening in every community. And so even if it seems like, oh, our rate is low, it's actually not that it's low, it's just that it's underreported, which is not a good thing. A low rate means that folks are not reaching out for help. And that's why it's underreported. There's no place to take statistics if they're not reaching out for services, because it's the domestic violence organizations that are collecting the data. So that means it's happening, and people are suffering in silence without getting the support that they need. Affordable housing is a serious problem we know in Sammamish and on the east side, and that keeps a large barrier for folks. For domestic violence survivors, if they don't have a place that they can leave to, and the alternative is being homeless and potentially taking their children and being homeless, that's a very big barrier for leaving. And a lot of folks will ask, why don't these women leave? Why can't they just leave? They're in these terrible situations. And it's because they have so many barriers. And in communities like ours, where there's a lot of stay-at-home moms who, because there's a lot of affluence and the male partner makes a good living and they don't have to work, it makes them that much more dependent on their partner because they're not able to have an income of their own to pay for the incredibly expensive cost of living outside of their home. The crime rates are low in Sammamish, and so DV represents actually a larger share of calls, which is a little counterintuitive to the underreporting, but it's because our crime rates are so low. And DV is one of the most dangerous types of calls that police officers get called on. So, and I just want to put just a little plug in around gun violence. It's not something that we are addressing on one of our areas, but we know that when there is a gun in the house, the risk for lethality, it goes way up in domestic violence situations and in suicide, for suicide as well. But in domestic violence, the risk of death is much higher when there's a gun in the house. And then with immigrant communities, there's greater isolation. There are not less services, as we heard, even in the youth mental health area. There's less services for immigrant women, and so there's more isolation, less places for them to seek help, and also within the communities, there can be even greater stigma than other communities. So the big takeaways is there's a lot of stigma still to report. People are really embarrassed, ashamed of that situation, even though it's not the victim's fault. I'm not going to go through, you can read them all, but there's a lot of barriers, economic, cultural, and others for women to get help. Any questions on domestic violence?
Okay, and then what we want to do is summarize. When you take a step back, as we did our work and we debated and discerned and talked, we found ourselves saying, you know, there are similarities across these areas, which is actually a good thing, because what that means is if you address some of the similarity areas, you can actually perhaps impact 2 or 3 of these need areas at the same time. So some of the similarities, there's a lack of awareness. If you don't know where to turn when you've got a mental wellness concern or domestic violence, God forbid, right? We as a city can begin to think about what's the audit of our own communication footprint and others, our partners beyond that, and start to find a way to use those tools, which don't have to cost a lot, but to get the word out. A booklet like this is actually a pretty darn good start. There's other things at City Hall, et cetera. I know Christy directed someone to us that really did not know where to turn. We can get a little better at meeting people where they are in crisis. They shouldn't have to be the one that thinks through all of this because they're in crisis, right? But there is connectivity across this. So lack of awareness where to go. Lack of connectivity, that leads to isolation. And every time Joyce says, how do you measure isolation and loneliness? It almost takes my breath away and I find myself writing it down because that's the crux of what is going on for so many of these need states. And actually it shows up by people acting out in their own way, right? So we have to be present to that and just finding ways for people to connect. Lower barriers to access, transportation, low cost, someone who can help me. And then we probably have all heard this before, but the truth is someone in crisis can feel very much invisible because they carry this thing and they don't know what to do with it. And they think everybody else is doing great and they're not. And so as a community, I think a good measure of the community is how do you deal and how do you work with people that are under the most duress? And are you there for them? And I think Sammamish has a chance to actually lead in that way going forward. So this next one, the only thing I'll say on this is in your packet. On the systemic level, so you can think about organizationally and systemic, and we think about this when we think about where are our grants going. But to the point Pam made earlier, some work could be done on the need in each area. When we had the domestic violence experts in, I asked a silly question, which was, is there any reason to think Sammamish is experiencing less than anyone else? And they kind of looked at me like, you got to be kidding me, right? So you can say that the underreportedness in Sammamish can be identified, and then you can put a number to that. And it might be several hundred people that are not reporting the situation they're in. Once we know that, we can actually begin to try and take some action. So that's certainly something we can keep working on. And then Jody has helped us learn, and you mentioned it earlier, that there are systemic things where if you're going to align with an organization, sometimes it's not just about the shiny thing, but it's about helping their capabilities in their structure. And then the final thing is next steps, listen, continuous improvement. That's very much what we're about. You'll see us come back to you with grant assessments, understand community needs as they change, become subject matter experts or go to them. Review, you'll hear from us on the grants, but this isn't a commission that's just about grants. We aspire, and I hope you see us doing much more than that, but we'll come back to you with that. We'll also come back to you with the results of I'm going to ask for the order in a minute and ask you to, I know we're not going to do it right now, but I am going to ask you to support our recommendation. And we'll also continue to refine those priorities. And then finally, this kind of interaction is super helpful for us, so I'd like to keep it going. And so the final thing, in conclusion, we would like to ask for you guys to support our recommendation when it comes time to vote. We will put your money and the city's money to good use. We can promise that, and we'll also come back and tell you how it went, and if things need to improve, we'll be transparent about that as well. So that is the end of our formal agenda. Any final comments from any? All right, Christy?
Yeah, first I just want to say thank you to the commission. It's nice to finally be in the same room with you all. I remember, I think it was about 4 years ago, sitting with Melanie Anderson and Tom Hornish, where we were like, we need to have more than Melanie processing all of these grant requests. And the idea was hatched in the meeting. It's nice to see it formalized into a commission, and I appreciate your deep dives into this. So I appreciate all your time on this, and just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you. I want to break the rules. Thank you. Thank you very much. So we will.
I just want to.
Okay, Jody had it.
I just wanted to thank the council for reappointing me to this commission. I really appreciate it, and hopefully I can keep up the good work that you've seen and even make it better. Thank you.
Glad to have you back.
Yeah.
Jody, did you
I want to just also acknowledge all of the council members. It's a diverse group, and it really lends for really great discussion. So I think that you selected a nice, diverse group, and it's really a privilege to be on the commission. I also want to just say that this is the first time that I've been at a joint session, and I think it's really important for us to get to know each other, and I wish we had had time to actually go around and introduce each other so we can learn more about each other, because I really do think that a lot of this work, particularly in human services, is really relational, and it would only make our work richer if we get to know each other a little bit. So I hope that we can do this again. I think it's helpful for us to hear your questions. It's really helpful to hear your questions. Even if we might push back or disagree, it's really important for us to hear what your concerns are, so that as we do our work, we can keep those ideas in mind. So thank you.
Sorry, I have one final thought, just following up on that. I think it would actually be beneficial to do this again prior to the council getting your recommendations and us dealing with the biennial budget, because as we went through these areas here this evening, I will acknowledge the gap that we have for seniors, which, Joyce kind of highlighted, and the fact that we had so many people come out for the senior center opening. And those are the kind of conversations that are really relevant for council when we go to, allocate funding for you guys to allocate for grants. So, I might even suggest a later on in this year meeting, but I certainly think, the annual study session, especially, I think, important in a budget year, as it is this year, to have those conversations.
Yeah, I'll look to our capable, we do as they tell us, so we'll schedule that, and perhaps we'll be invited back. There you go.
I want to thank Rita and Mike, our staff, for their support. Without you for the last few years, what you do for us is amazing. We give you the idea, you put it together and give it back, and we say, that's messed up, fix it. But you do it anyway. Thank you so much, though.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate the time.
Okay, council, we're going to take a 5-minute health and safety break. Okay, calling the meeting back to order for this evening. And
I'm all disjointed.
to finish up on our joint meeting with the Human Services Commission, we need to decide whether we are going to make a recommendation, and if so, if we're going to make a recommendation to table this to the next meeting, or if we're going to make a recommendation on. So do I hear any motions from the floor? If so, I do see one on my screen. Councilmember Stewart.
I move that we approve the recommendation as presented from the Human Services Commission.
Okay, do I see a second? No second, okay.
I have a subsequent motion then. I would move that we fund the, and I'm all disjointed here with my notes, CrossPath at $130,895, and that we allocate $24,821 to, is it Cross Connections?
Can you repeat, please?
Yes, $130,895 to CrossPath. That gives us the 2 FTEs, and $24,821 to Cross Connection, which gives us 0.5 FTE.
Okay, so I have a motion on the floor. Do I hear a second to that?
Second.
Discussion, Councilmember Stewart.
Do I get to speak to my motion first, though?
Well, if you would like to speak to your motion.
I would, yes, please. So I think when we originally set off to give the $150,000 to the Health and Human Services Commission, this was in reaction to some very unfortunate events that transpired in our community. This is additional funding over and beyond the biennial budget to which we gave the Health and Human Services Commission. And these 2 proposals from Cross Connection and from Cross Paths allows an immediate need to be filled in the community with counselors. So this would give us 2 FTEs at Cross Path, one being a combination, it would have a master's degree, they would have behavioral health as well as substance abuse ability to, and then also a specialist just for traditional behavioral health. And then the 0.5 FTE at Cross Connections that they requested as well, giving us 2.5 new counselors in response to what seems to be a void in our community for counselors. I think we heard from the commission tonight that Cross Paths alone turned away 6 potential clients just last week.
Councilmember Stewart.
So it is true that we, as a community, experienced 2 tragic deaths of 2 teens at Skyline High School last August and September. And after that, we asked the commission to go out and come back to us with a recommendation of what we needed to do immediately to try to help with that. The commission jumped into action quite miraculously, I thought, and within about a week came back to us with a recommendation and a request for $175,000 so that they could get counselors in place, looking to try to get them in place by the holiday season, which is notoriously a challenging time for people in crisis. And if not by the holidays, at the very least before finals in January. The council rejected that motion and tasked the commission to go out and create a bid process and to take $150,000 and to go determine what was best needed with that $150,000. Once again, our Human Services Commission, with their incredible expertise, went out and dug deep. You put out the RFP. You got 10 proposals back, you created criteria, and you evaluated all of those proposals, and you looked across the community at what was needed. I can't thank you enough and can't say enough how impressed I am that a group of people with so many credentials, with so much experience, can have such a depth of knowledge in these areas, can have such compassion, and can still do such a great job of creating objective criteria and evaluating proposals against that and coming up with some really great recommendations. You've obviously spent countless hours on digging deep into this, and I just don't think it's appropriate for us to sit here and question that at this moment in time because we haven't spent the same amount of time in looking at what is best for our youth with the $150,000 limit that you've been given. The other thing that I don't think we know, when we looked at the proposals, Cross Paths bid came back to us at $150,000. I don't know that we can just say we're going to give you $135,000 or $136,000 and we're going to get what we're asking for. I don't think it works that way. I think Jody addressed that during the study session, that these proposals come in, that it isn't just that we get to say we just want to pay for this. There are overhead costs that come with all of these services. So I don't think we can just tease it apart. I don't know that the what was the other one? The crisis texting and hotline. I'm not sure that if we reduce that number down that we can just get something for that. So I don't think that this motion, as stated, is something that we can just go and approve. I think we'd have to ask the commission to go back and see if that's even possible or reasonable. So I'm not sure that even if we approve this motion, that it's something that's feasible.
Any other comments? Okay, well, I do have a comment. One, I agree with Councilmember Stewart. I do not support the motion. The reason I don't support the motion is because of the fact that I do not believe, I think you guys did a really good job. And to go back and say we should now go back and put two counselors there and not do this, I think that's wrong. I was holding back on not supporting your recommendation because of the fact that the one thing I'm in my mind I'm still stuck on is that Lake Washington School District one, which was with 100 people out in the public, because to me that is such a huge deal to me. And I just wanted to think through it one more time. And I was just going to ask that we table this for 1 week so I could do that. So for that, I'm really disappointed because I think you guys did a great job. I think you did exactly what we asked you to do. And so I do not think going back and asking for you to go back and asking that we added another counselor to CrossPass. I do know that Lake Washington has added staff to their counseling departments so that their counselors have got extra time. I do know that there's been a lot of changes in the schools and the counseling time, so I would have to go back and research all of that before I would think adding another counselor to CrossPass would be a good idea. And I certainly wouldn't be prepared to even vote on that tonight. So again, I support your recommendation. Councilmember Ross?
Thank you. I tend to agree with the mayor on waiting a week, and primarily the reason is, number one, this is an extremely well thought out proposal by the commission, and just a few unanswered questions that I had. I could have asked earlier, but I want to need feedback on this. Is a program director was part of the request for the last group supporting us, and raises the question, if there's no program director, how do they have a track record? And experience was a key criteria for us to be effective immediately in the situation we're in, defined as crisis immediate service. So that's something I need to think about. I would lean towards what Deputy Mayor Malchow proposed. However, for the reasons I want to really look at that last aspect, and are they prepared? Are we funding a startup? And I don't think we have time to fund a startup, but I think later in the biennial budget process we look at, because they have an excellent reputation in the region from what I learned. And so I think hold off a week would be helpful to think about it at this point for me.
Okay, before we go to round two, is there anybody else? Before we go to round two, is there anybody else who has any comments? Okay, going on to round two. Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, so two things. One, I'm happy to withdraw my motion if Councilmember Gamblin is willing to allow the council an additional week to consider the proposal. But second, I didn't throw in haphazardly the second FTE at CrossPath. That is part of CrossPath's ask, so that's why I put it in there. So, but if Councilmember Gamblin is willing to,
Yep.
Okay, all right, so I will withdraw my motion. I will make a new motion that we table till next week.
Second.
Okay. We have a first and a second on the floor discussion. And, okay, no discussion. Calling for the vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, 6-1. Okay, next on our list is unfinished business, revised city council rules of procedure.
Good evening, Council. My name is Mike Sugg. I am a senior management analyst here at the city. And tonight we are here to talk about your rules of procedure. So, Council reviewed the rules of procedure at their retreat a few weeks ago, and we looked at a matrix at that time of basically staff suggested changes, basically things that we had heard Council talk about or that staff had seen, put that into a matrix and reviewed that at the retreat. In addition, at the retreat, we talked about some additional changes that were suggested by the Deputy Mayor that were not part of the matrix at that time. So in your packet for tonight, we've updated that matrix that we all reviewed, and there are now 2 sections. So the first is what we already discussed at the retreat, and the second section is Deputy Mayor Malchow's suggestions. So the portion of the matrix that has the blue heading is what we've already reviewed, and it sounds like we've gone through generally everything here, and there seemed to be mostly agreement on all these items. And then the orange section on your screen here are what Deputy Mayor Malchow had provided to us after the retreat as some additional suggestions. So once we go through that, we'll have some time for additional suggestions from the council members. I know that the mayor had some additions. I'm not sure if anybody else came tonight with more changes. So I'm not sure what the best way to go through this would be. We could look at the blue section first, what we've already reviewed, and I guess just ask, are there any additional questions or changes about any of these items that we talked about during the retreat?
One of my changes I could actually put underneath there, which would be to the 4.1.3. And I'm going to read from different cities, and because it has to do with the agenda. And it has to do with how the agenda's decided on. And I was looking, I really liked how Redmond phrased there, so hang on. I got a bunch of different cities out here. But basically, it is that the mayor shall work with the staff to finalize the agenda. So that, because what's happening is the agenda, I'm not seeing the agenda at all before I get it in the packet. And so like today I could have said, hey, you know what, and last week, we need to cut down on some of those slides. Mm-hmm. Or, hey, we need to add this, or, you know, the council, don't forget the council wants that added on, or, you know, the council's not ready to see that, or whatever it's gonna, I mean, as long as there's that going on, that's fine, but it's too late to add it by the time we're getting that packet and nobody's asked. So there's got to be some coordination that's happening, and it's just not. And so I'm trying to see, and let me see, Redmond's wording was really good. I didn't care for Mercer Island's wording. I didn't care for Issaquah's wording. And if they're watching, not that I didn't like your wording.
Oh, I'm sure they're watching.
Oh. Every time I don't say that, they watch it, and then I have to go, oops. Mary Lou Polly will say she watched our meeting. Okay. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that whole thing? on the agenda of wanting input onto the agenda.
Yeah.
Okay, well, do you want to?
You got lights though.
Okay, so let's, Councilmember Stewart, then Deputy Mayor.
So are we just talking about the agenda one? You want us to do that one? Okay, so I have two thoughts. One would be if we're working to change the timing on the packets, that what we could do, Mayor, is since we're going to try to get that done further in advance of the meetings, that it go out to council before it be published to the public, so that if there's some sort of feedback that need to be provided, so it isn't just the mayor. I don't know if that's a possibility, because like this meeting, for example, like I didn't know it was a special meeting as opposed to a study session until the packet was published on Friday. So things like when we have conflicts, like Councilmember Ritchie, who had a concert, if it was just a study session and I had a conflict like that, I would be less concerned. But when it's a special meeting, that's a bigger deal, right? So not having that information in advance as a council member is kind of a big deal. And quite honestly, I oftentimes feel blindsided by what's on the agenda, because it will be different than what was on the long-term agenda. And so it just gives us less time to be prepared. So I don't know if there's something, I mean, I appreciate the mayor wanting to step in, but I think it's not just the mayor that needs some sort of coordination. But I think Melanie had something to add to that.
Well, Mike, city attorney.
I don't know if I have anything to add, but the way iCompass works is once we shoot it out, it goes out to everyone.
Including the public?
Yeah.
There's no way to just give it to the council?
I don't think so. I'll double check with my brain on this, Tammy. But I think that we would have to send you some other sort of, I don't know, PDF, and maybe just seeing the agenda would be enough.
Logistics aside, a question to city attorney, isn't that going out to all the council OPMA?
Not if we don't talk amongst ourselves, just to push it out and give us information. There's no reason why we can't share information.
I'm asking.
No, it's not an OPMA violation to share an agenda in advance. No, it's not.
And the individual councils would give direct feedback, but not circulate reply all.
Correct. If you're not replying all to an email and having a discussion, there's not a digital violation.
Okay, thank you.
And then the other thing on the agenda is that I expressed this at the retreat, is that I too struggle with the idea that a motion cannot be made during a meeting. I think that violates the spirit and the actual Robert's Rules of Order, and I do think that it's just an unnecessary and draconian rule. So I'd like to see. I'd like to make sure that our rule does not preclude one from making a motion during a meeting.
Okay, so we have Deputy Mayor, followed by Councilmember Treen.
Yeah, so specifically on 4.1.3, we heard public comment tonight, but I want to correct what was stated, because in 2016, we did not alter this rule. What we altered was how you get something on the agenda, because originally the council rules stated you needed 4 council members just to get something on the agenda. That was an OPMA violation. We changed it to 3. It didn't have anything to do with adding things to a finalized agenda at a city council meeting. And then the other thing that was stated during public comment was that this was a draconian measure by the majority of council, and this is a staff recommendation, not a council recommendation. But I do think it holds merit, because as it currently stands, an item can be added to the agenda by a minority. You need 3 council members to add something to the agenda. You could also appeal simply to the mayor, who has the unilateral authority to add something to the agenda, which would be 2. To do so at the meeting, at the beginning, then requires a majority, or 4. Midstream in a meeting, if you we're not able to get it on the agenda with 3 or 2 if you just simply ask the mayor to add it on, and you couldn't get 4 at the beginning of the meeting, I'm not sure I understand the point of bringing up an item that isn't on the agenda for discussion for 2 reasons. One, it's not transparent to the public. They don't have an opportunity to comment on something prior to it being brought up. We have had problems on this council with things being dropped in the middle of a council meeting. In fact, one time we had a council member walk out because they were so frustrated that something got dropped in the middle of a council meeting. So I don't think it's a good practice to surprise council members with things. And again, if you cannot get 3 or 2, if you ask the mayor, 4 at the beginning of the meeting, I'm not sure what the point is in having a discussion on something that we know probably will not carry with the council, other than to just simply grandstand at the dais, and I'm not sure that I don't support that.
Councilmember Trine? Oh.
I'll concede to Richie.
Oh, yeah, you guys switched around on me here. Okay, so.
No, it's all good. Always switch seats.
You did on my screen.
No, more to the mayor's point about, I guess I'm questioning if an agenda can be sent out as a draft to the public and to everyone with the understanding that it can be amended up to a certain date. More to the mayor's point, right? I mean, if we're able to have a draft agenda after the mayor and the deputy mayor and the city manager sit down on the Monday and come up with the agenda, and then it's sent out on maybe Tuesday, and then there's 24, 48 hours for the council to review, evaluate, whatever, or the mayor to, to say, hey, that's too many slides or whatever it is, then a formalized or a finalized agenda could be sent out by X date, which would give proper notice to the public and to the council members. I mean, I agree with Deputy Mayor Malchow. I think that what's been provided here seems to be if we're able to actually give council members the ability to stand up and say something or raise their hand or push a button and say something, if you can get the support of the mayor or the city manager, whatever it is, if it's urgent, we're trying to build process, right? And so the process is you go to a agenda meeting, you put your thing together, and you make your case and you try to get it on the agenda. And if you can't get it on the agenda, there's a reason why you can't get it on the agenda. So, I think that builds a process going forward. I guess I just want to make sure that the mayor's issues are properly stated or properly evaluated beyond the whole who can put what on the agenda in terms of timing. So I guess my question to the legal folks is, are we able to do some sort of draft agenda? Melanie would put it together on, say, a Tuesday. We'd get it back. We'd have a 24-hour, possibly 48-hour evaluation period, and then a formalized agenda by X date. Is there anything wrong with that from?
No, there isn't. And I think to Councilmember Melchow's point earlier, if 4 council members behind the scenes are creating an agenda, that can be an OPMA violation. What you're talking about, however, is circulating a draft for comment and not hitting reply all when you respond. And there's no, in fact, the city where I was most recently city attorney did exactly that.
Okay. Does that work for you, Melanie? Awesome. Thank you.
So is there a general consensus to add, I think it'd be an additional item to say something to the effect of a draft agenda, basically the first page of what you see in the packet will be sent out to the council on a Tuesday or Wednesday ahead of the meeting packet for comment, and we'll put a time period in there between which council members can submit comments or suggested revisions or what have you. So should we add something like that to the rules, is what I'm asking?
Yes.
It might be less specific, like not say the Tuesday, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I just want to read this phrase because this covers everything, and I don't care how we switch it around. But when I read it, it really works. And it says that and so it can be who's ever doing the meetings. I don't care what you call this person sitting in this chair. We'll work with the administration to schedule council meetings, set agendas, and determine topics for study sessions. It's basically taking control of the agenda. This is the first time I've ever sat in this chair, whether it be here or the Water District or wherever, where I had no idea what was coming on that agenda until it showed up. And that's just the craziest thing I've ever heard of. So it's just a matter of whether we do it as 4 people 2 days before, or if something happens and we've got to, put a call out to who's ever chairing that meeting, somebody needs to be able to have a say in there of, hey, we're not going to do 50 slides. 50 slides are out. So there's just got to be coordination with whoever is chairing the meeting.
So the draft agenda that I was envisioning that we would send out in advance of the actual packet being published wouldn't include the specific agenda items, right?
Right.
So you wouldn't know, for example, that the PowerPoint is 50
Okay,
slides.
so now we're back to coordinating with whoever's chairing the meeting.
Yes.
I think there's another item, though.
We can do that in council rules.
Okay. All right, I guess we'll address that in council rules.
We're doing right
Okay, so we've got Councilmember Stewart, followed by Deputy Mayor.
now. So I think there's another item talking about the timing of the agenda, isn't there, in here, I thought? So I think we should look at these things together, because I think that the agenda item, the other one on the agenda item, there we go.
Yeah.
Is that you guys are going to try to get it out 2 Fridays before the meeting. So I think that maybe what we can look at here is maybe there's a draft agenda that is shared, and as either as part of that or ahead of that, and then the materials come a few days later or something like that. So maybe we just allow you guys to kind of figure out what this timing's going to be, because I think at the retreat we talked about some options, and you guys were going to go try to figure out what was doable. I think we all agreed that getting it on a Thursday or Friday and having to be ready on Tuesday was challenging for everybody, because if we did have questions for staff, there wasn't a lot of time to kind of deal with that. So I think we can address that, Mayor, if we let them kind of work out a schedule here with this item. And I think you raise a great point. I do want to circle back on, I'm all about process, and I'm all about, not grandstanding, but at the same time, if I need to get 3 people or 2 other people to agree on an agenda item, if I go and I ask someone and they say no, I can't really go ask 2 other people, because now I've created an OPMA violation. So even the 3 council members to get something on the agenda can violate OPMA, because by asking someone and them saying no, I effectively have caucused them. And that is exactly what we are not allowed to do. So I still think that there are processes. There is Robert's Rules of Order. If someone makes a motion and someone seconds it and the majority of the council doesn't like it, we can either call the question, take a vote, and vote it down, or make a motion to table it and move on. I don't see why we would. I think Robert's Rules of Order has been around for a really long time, and I'm sure that we are not the first council to have questions about this, and that's why all of those processes already exist. So I do think that saying that a council member can't make a motion about something that isn't on the agenda during a meeting is draconian. And even, like I said, even the 3-person thing, unless I already know the 2 people that are going to agree with me, then I'm potentially going to create an OPMA violation. Would that be correct?
The OPMA violation scenario that's most recently discussed is the emailing and replying all, and you're kind of almost in a chat room, essentially, at that point when council members are doing that. I'm not specifically aware of an OPMA violation occurring if you're talking to your fellow council members one by one.
But my understanding is that a serial meeting, so if I meet individually with too many people about the same subject, that is still, as long as it exceeds 3 people, that is an OPMA violation.
Well, you're talking about a scenario where you're meeting with 2 other council members. That in and of itself is not an OPMA violation.
But when I go to that next person, so I asked 2 people, one says yes, one says no. Now I have to go to the 4th council member to get the approval to put it on the agenda. Isn't that an OPMA violation?
I'm not sure that it is.
Well, I think we need to know that before we can make this a rule.
Aren't you just asking for the support to discussing things?
I still think we need to get an answer on that. And again, whether it is or it isn't, I don't know why we think we need to supersede Robert's Rules of Order.
Keep in mind from a parliamentarian standpoint that if there is a need to to make a motion and take final action on something that's not on your agenda, you can always do that in a regular meeting, but not at a special, unless the item's on the agenda. If you are desperate to have a motion on the floor, you can suspend your rules as well. And I believe under Robert's rules, suspension of rules requires a majority of +1.
Okay. Deputy Mayor?
Yeah, so I think we've solved the issue relative to getting out the agenda, contrary to what the public may or may not think relative to how the agenda gets hatched. It's actually staff that puts together the agenda, and the mayor and I, or whoever is sitting in these roles, finds out the agenda at the same time that the rest of the council does. Relative to making motions during the middle of a council meeting, I still support staff's recommendation because it can still be brought up at the beginning of a meeting prior to us finalizing and voting on the agenda. So I fail to understand what could come up in the middle of a meeting that would require a motion that is not relative to something on our agenda. So I still support this standing, and because these are council rules, if for some reason we are to get some differing opinion from our city attorney's office, we can simply change them. So I'm supportive of it. Oh, and one additional thing relative to the language that Redmond uses. It should be noted that Redmond is a strong mayor, so that mayor would have a heavier hand in setting that agenda than we would in Sammamish. So.
I'm reading the rules that are for the council, not for the mayor. The mayor has their own set of rules. Okay, next we have got Councilmember Ross, followed by Councilmember Ritchie.
So first of all, on the Councilmember Stewart was talking about the risk of going from council member to council member till you get two other supporters. What we have done traditionally is simply send an email, probably the city manager and mayor, say, I'd like to add this item to the agenda, copy the entire council, and if and when two other council members say, I support that, sending it to the mayor and city manager only, it's done. I would also recommend do the same for agenda adjustments, because it's going to be I don't think anything will ever change on the agenda if we're just shooting stuff to Mike or whoever's receiving the input. I think we do the same thing. We say, I recommend we change or modify item 4 on the agenda, copy the whole council, and then the council responds to the focal for the agenda, agree, disagree, until you get, in that case, I guess 4 votes, something to that effect, so that we have an orderly process that's OPMA proof, and it allows us to be very succinct in that. As far as the motions, if we can't establish what's on the agenda at the beginning of the meeting, then we should know what we want to bring up and see if the rest of the council supports that for discussion for that day. I don't think we're squelching motions later in the meeting. I think we need to be clear. Motions related to the subject at hand is permitted, but not bringing up a new item about shaving all the dogs with long hair. I mean, we just don't do that. That's what we're trying to prevent.
Councilmember Ritchie?
It's actually me. And Chris covered both my points, so.
Oh.
We ended up in different seats. Sorry.
Oh.
You got Reggie down here.
Yeah, he's down there. He wants to talk.
Just real quick.
All right. Councilmember Ritchie.
So I agree with Deputy Mayor Malchow in as much as there's a process for putting something on the agenda, and it seems to me that, sat through enough of these now, that we don't, if there is a need to have something added to the agenda, that it's incumbent upon a council member just to hit their button at that point or call for a point of order, or I would like to add something to the agenda, it is X, prior to our approval of the agenda. There is a space for that to happen, even if it hasn't come before the meeting, come before the agenda review, the deputy mayor, the mayor, so there's that opening there. I don't know if that's enough or not. I'm happy to see if that works, and if not, then I guess the other side of this is, though I'm not a fan of having to suspend the rules frequently, I hope we don't have to do that, but I guess it would make sense to me that if there is something that has happened, it is not on the agenda, it does require an agenda adjustment mid-meeting, then we would have a motion to suspend the rules, and I would imagine it'd be something like, I would like to raise a motion to suspend the rules, to add this to to add X motion to the agenda, and the motion is X, and then that's voted on. And if it requires a majority plus one, so be it. I mean, it is what it is. I don't know if that's Robert's rules or what, but I mean, I guess for what it's worth, there's things in this whole list that I do support, and that's one of them. There's things in this list that I don't support. So I'm concerned about voting on it as a group versus voting on it individually. So that's more my point. Thank you.
Okay, so we've been around twice. Do we have a direction? Do you have a direction?
I think we have to formally vote on it, but I don't know if you want us to vote on them individually or as a package deal.
So we're not adopting the final rules of procedure tonight. We're going to take all the feedback that you provide today and bring
That's what I thought.
a revised copy on the 18th, but it still would be nice to know if there is support from the majority when we do bring that updated copy back to you next week.
So, so the only one that I think we were doing any changes to are the 4.1.3.
No, that's all we've talked about so far.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so that's the only one we've talked about so far. Great, this is gonna be a long night. Okay, so
But did they have our?
why don't you read to us the changes that you have to that?
So I'm not sure if this is a part of 4.1.3 or a separate section, but what was that?
Down, farther down, that section about when the delivery of the agenda happens.
When having them review it beforehand.
Yeah.
So I think we'll add a new section coming back about the meeting agenda coming to council ahead of the packet being published. So that's the main change that I have on there right now.
That's correct.
There seems to be strong support for.
Yep, that's correct.
I guess I had one question on that, and that is, so we're going to email you the agenda. If we don't hear back, do we just assume it's okay? And if we do get someone suggesting a change, do we need to wait until there's 4?
Yeah, because that's the spot that I think leaves you in a really, really funny spot of then waiting, which is why, normally I would say you leave it with the mayor. I would suggest, and this is going to just be my suggestion, is that you hear from everybody, and if you end up in a situation where you haven't heard from that, your final call is to call the mayor and say, what's your call on this? So if she hasn't heard from 4 to
add something.
Yeah, then she should call the mayor and say, what do you want done with this?
Perfect. Thank you.
And let the mayor take the heat.
You can handle it.
Is there anything else that, the other thing that I wanted added, we just decided was going to go into the rules. Yeah.
Can we ask a question?
Yeah, like
on
how he
that?
picked that up. Okay. Is there anything else that was supposed to go in there? The other part was going to go into the rules.
Yeah, there's questions.
Okay, so I guess we have a bunch of questions. Okay, going to,
Are we still talking about that same thing, or can we?
no,
Still talking, I have a question on that same thing.
All right. I have something different, so. Other rules.
all right, going to any other questions on this particular item? Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. Okay, so I just wanted to get clarification because Melanie said 4. She'd have to hear back from 4 people to add something to the agenda, but our current council rules say all you need is 3. So why do we need 4?
No, it's 3.
So then why would you be in a position when you have 4 and that Karen would take the heat? I'm confused. If you hear back from 3 people, they want something on the agenda, it goes on, right? Okay,
I
so-
heard someone say 4, so that's why I asked the question.
Okay, so
Because
yeah,
it is 3.
It's 3.
Yeah.
Okay, so you don't have to take the heat.
Just
Okay.
I still think you have that closed loop, right? If you don't hear anything from anybody, you
Yeah,
reach
she
out to
knows.
the mayor.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
what she meant.
Okay, got it.
Don't stall the process.
Okay, and then Councilmember Stewart.
All right, so section 2.5, we had asked that when directing work, one, I think that the topic is a little bit misleading because council would never direct staff work. It would be if council had a request that would require work from the staff, that before the city manager would approve that or move forward with that, we had this, any council request that would require significant staff work to fulfill should be approved by at least 4 council members. I still think we need to define significant. I think that if we are concerned enough to create such a rule, that leaving significant up to the eye of the beholder is not going to solve the problem. So I still think we need to put a bar in there as to what significant means. So I think it needs to be, a number of hours. If it's going to require more than 8 hours, 6 hours, 12 hours, I'm not sure I care. I just think it needs to be defined.
It was 2. I think what I heard before was 2 hours was significant work.
All right.
From Chip. So Chip would be in the role of evaluating that currently as the acting city.
So I say we put that in there then. Whatever that, again, I'm not as concerned about what that number is. I think it needs to be a number because significant could be 5 minutes or 14 days. And I just think we need more clarity.
Okay.
So is the recommendation from staff too?
That's what I heard. 2 hours would be requiring significant staff work. So if it's in the estimation of the acting city manager that's going to require more than 2 hours of staff work, it's going to go back to council to get at least 4 council members to agree to pursue that.
So as I understand it, the scenario would be, I have a question. I want to know what would be the impact if we painted all of the buildings with silver reflective paint? Would that, be a positive, environmental impact to the city? If that's going to require more than 2 hours worth of work, then that question can't be, right? If the research to figure that out is more than 2 hours, then that needs to come before council and we vote on it and say, yes, that is something we want staff time to be spent on. Otherwise, if we don't have a majority, then that doesn't happen because we don't want to randomize staff with our questions of doing research and finding stuff out. Now, we may find that 2 isn't the right number, and if we find that that's too low, we can adjust that. But again, I think it needs to be defined.
Okay. I've got other questions.
Do we want to do these one at a time? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Are we on this, questions on this number? So we're on 2.5. Okay, so going to Councilmember Ross.
Yeah, we need to do something with the topic. I agree with Councilmember Stewart. As far as defining it with 1, not 2 hours, whatever, I don't think that's necessary. If we make a request of the city manager to do work, he's going to say that's going to take a significant amount of time, subjectively. It may be an hour, a significant amount of time during a point of time where the staff is heavily engaged in other activities. So it does disrupt their work. So then it defaults to the council to vote. Well, okay, you told it takes a significant amount of time. Describe the amount of time or the concern you have, and then we'll vote on it. I think it should be as simple as that. Let's not define it in terms of time. I think that gets a little bit unnecessary.
Okay, then we have Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with Councilmember Ross on the parameter of hours that we task that with. My suggestion would be is to add in there that the city manager should be the judge of what is defined as significant and make a call on that. And I want to use a real-time example as to what might actually take more significant time that I requested staff to engage Rob Gannon from King County Metro to get him out here to Sammamish for a meeting because King County Metro is going to run a levy later later this year. And if we want anything on that levy, we need Rob Gannon out here in Sammamish. So I did ask staff to engage with King County Metro to have them out here. So I think it should be in the city manager's court as to whether or not that requires council action to ask Rob Gannon and his staff to come out to Sammamish so that we can get something on the levy that's beneficial for Sammamish Metro-wise.
Okay, then we've got Councilmember Ritchie.
Thank you. I'm not sure. I hear what you guys are saying. I guess I'm concerned that this is on here at all from the beginning. I thought that it would take a majority of council to direct staff to do anything. So I'm not entirely sure why we just wouldn't have a motion to ask, in the deputy mayor's example, a very simple motion put on the agenda to direct staff to have we can be that organized, right? To have the folks from King County Metro or a representative from King County Metro to come out. We put it before the council votes it up or down. Staff has its clear direction. It doesn't have to be, well, I asked this and they said it was going to take X hours, or it is or isn't significant, or somebody else's judgment. I mean, I guess this is our responsibility, and I don't want to put pressure on staff to determine what is significant. I don't think that's something that the city manager should have to judge either. I think that's our job, right? As city council, we're supposed to put something on the agenda like we've talked about. So I think this is a point that I think is unnecessary, because that's our job, is to put something on the agenda, vote it up or down, then you've got your direction or not from the full council. So, thank you.
Okay, council, before we go to round two, anybody else will not speak round one? All right, round two, Councilmember Stewart.
I think if we are going to put it on here, that it needs to be defined, because we need to protect staff. If we leave it subjective and the city manager says this is significant and this one isn't, and they turn out to be the same, then we're going to put that person in a position where they're going to be criticized one way or the other. And I think that if we are going to put this on here, I think to Councilmember Ritchie's point, I would be fine if it wasn't, and we said anything that's going to require that has to come before council. But if we want to give the city manager some leeway, and we want to have parameters around it, I think they need to be more specific, because I think that, again, if you're going to define it, then define it. If you're not going to define it, don't make a rule. I just think that we're setting up a situation where we're going to create, one person asks and they go do it, and it takes 12 hours, and then somebody else comes along and it's only going to be 15 minutes, and they say, no, that's too significant. I'm being extreme, obviously, but the researching the proposal to shave all the long-haired dogs could take a really long time. So we need to make sure that we're either defining it and we're clear, or we don't put it on here at all.
Okay, Councilmember Ross, followed by Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, following up on Councilmember Ritchie's comments, if we had clairvoyance, we would know what goes on the agenda of things we would like to ask for. It's more typical in a discussion that we find we need additional data or additional information, and that only surfaces through the discussion and dialogue during a council meeting. So that's why we would pivot and ask the city manager, can we get that? And he just simply replies, no, that would take, or reach out to his staff, that'll take us a lot of time, and he will ask us to vote on it. Or alternatively, say, yeah, we can do that, and we move on. I don't know why we add the added complexity that Councilmember Stewart's talking about, but that's how I feel about the whole thing. So I'm done.
Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, so this was a staff suggestion, and so I'm guessing it's been an issue in the past, and that is why it's here. And I think letting the city manager be the determinant of what is significant or not should be sufficient.
And Councilmember Ritchie.
Not to be redundant, but just to seek clarity here. I'm taking it that this is a request. The 2.5 is for when we're not in a meeting, right? If we're not in a meeting,
yep,
we should not be asking. My opinion is we should not be asking staff to do things unless the majority of the council has asked to do it. Now, if there's something that needs to be done prior to a meeting, and it's not on the agenda, well then, we have a problem, right? I mean, then we have to suspend the rules and go through that whole rigmarole. So if we're in a meeting and something needs to be done, and we're all sitting here together and we direct staff, hey, we would like to direct staff to do X. We have a motion, we have an up and down vote, we're good. But if this is something that's when we're not in a meeting format, I take it this is meant just, Mike, correct me, my inclination is to think this is to avoid individual council members from essentially directing staff to do things, kind of chasing down errands or running things down that may take an inordinate amount of time, and suddenly you're down chasing things, chasing down a lead, and that may or may not, you're basically being asked to say, is that priority, or is what I was tasked to do from the agenda, from the actions, from the direction of the council priority? And there's only a certain amount of time in your day. So I guess I go back to my thing. If this is something that is focused on when we're not meeting, when we're not in a meeting format, this is, hey, Mike, it's Jason. Can you chase this down for me? Dude, it's going to take like 4 or 5 hours. There's no way. Come on, man. You know it's going to take like 20 minutes. Come on. Just figure this out for me. That puts you in a really awkward spot, right? Or, hey, city manager, can you, help me out on this? I don't think we should be in the business of doing that at all. So if we're not in a meeting, we should put it on the agenda. If we can't put it on the agenda, then it better be pretty important so we can suspend the rules and have a vote on it when we're at the meeting. That's all I'm saying. So I still don't think it's something that's worth our time, because I think it adds a lot of confusion and problems for staff. So,
Councilmember Gamblin. Treen.
Thank you, Mayor. If the topic is directing staff work, then the outcome from the retreat should have just said that any council request that would require significant staff work to fulfill should be approved by the city manager.
No.
So, city manager is the one who directs the staff. So we direct the city manager, and I believe, isn't that 2.6? Council members may directly contact department if we talk to the city manager first. So who do we go through? Who do we hire? The city manager. Then how do we set the agendas? Through the with the help of the city manager. How does the staff get their work done? They're the ones that are communicating with the city manager. So we need a city manager.
Okay, so we have finished round 2.
I think going back to Councilmember Treen's point, I think the reason for having it be approved by 4 council members is to ensure that what the council member is requesting represents, the will of the council. It represents their priorities, their interests. And yeah, did you have a?
So I agree.
Yeah.
But also, isn't that the city manager then would also be taking on the majority of the council, their position, and working with us to move forward the agenda of what we're trying to do, creating that vision for the city, and then moving that vision forward. So I hear what you're saying, Mike, but I maybe I don't agree with you respectfully that, if the city manager is leading the city in a way that is what's being directed by the council and the policies that are being enacted here on the dais, then I'm with Richie then this is unnecessary. Unless there's a problem, and hey, call me new here, but unless there's a problem that the city staff isn't doing what the council and the policy that's being directed from the dais. So if that's going on, then we have another problem.
I don't think that's the case. I think, for example, if a council member says, I want you to perform a study on this issue, and it's going to take a lot of work to put that study together.
Then the city manager would say, this isn't going to happen right now, or we need to put this at a later date.
I think
we're in the middle of a budget.
Right. It could potentially put the city manager in a difficult place because he's unilaterally making the decision of doing the study or not. By going to the council and saying, what do you all think about doing this study? Then
Well, he can do that, right? Because he's working with us. He has the ability to do that. No? I'm not sure. I think he has to. okay, maybe I'm wrong, but
No, I wasn't going to try and explain anything to him, but I was going to try and make a clarifying point here. If you are contacting any staff members, which if we pass these council rules, all you can do is contact department heads, you also have to contact the city manager. So if you're asking a director for something, and trust me, in your time on council, you will ask the directors for stuff, like information. Like as we try and wade through decisions, there are times when I'll reach out to David Pyle about something development regulation wise. But when I do that, I always CC the city manager. So if I'm asking David Pyle for something that is considered significant by our city manager, he's going to chime in and say, nope, can't do that. Otherwise, the assumption that I run on, because I'm always communicating with the city manager when I'm emailing staff members, is that if it's too significant, he'll put the kibosh on it. So I think the language here is fine, and if we feel like we need to define significant, I would again ask that we simply give it to the city manager to define significant.
Okay, so basically, Pam, I'm going to let you kind of rebut on that one because we just walked ourselves into a third round.
Well, I just very quickly, I just want to make sure that it's applied. I mean, from my perspective, this is to protect the city manager, right? Yes, no city council person can direct staff. The city manager has to be copied, but not defining significant puts the city manager in a situation where significant can be applied differently depending on which council member is asking, and that is just going to create trouble. It just is. And so I'm fine if we want to allow the city manager to define significant, but it needs to be defined so that it is applied the same way for everyone.
Capture that one, didn't you?
All right, I'm going to ask that we take a vote on this because this is just ridiculous to go back and forth, and it's 9:45.
We're not voting on anything yet, remember?
I'm sorry.
You're taking feedback.
That point of order? Point of order. I thought he was, Mike, I thought you were just collecting data tonight. We're not voting on anything. Is that right?
Yep.
To know what to include in the packet for next week, it'd be helpful to know what the sentiment of the...
Can I make a suggestion? Just, it's not my turn. Can I make a suggestion? Is that okay? Can you possibly give us some options, like an option A, B, and C, that we can vote on when we do vote on these things? Because I think there is some different opinions about what works, right? What wouldn't work or not, because I don't know if we've given you a lot of stuff, and to Deputy Mayor Malchow's point, did you capture all that? That's a lot to capture, right? So, I mean, I think there's like some options that have been thrown out there. I don't know that there's a consensus, and maybe we can, move on. That'd be cool.
Yeah, let us work on some options, and we'll come back to you.
Right on.
If that doesn't work, then we'll take a vote on it next week and be done with it. Okay, moving on to, do we really have to hit 2.6 since we hit most of it with 2.5?
Yeah, got that.
Okay.
Scroll quickly.
3.2.2, going once, going twice.
Oh.
We do? Oh, here we go again. All right. Deputy Mayor and then Councilmember Stewart.
Yeah, I think when we talked about the study sessions at the retreat, we also we had that discussion about removing the study session on the first Monday before we talked about what was on our work plan for 2020, and we have a pretty stout work plan. I think we might want to not remove the Monday study sessions formally through our council rules, and if we don't have anything, we can cancel the study session, but to remove them completely, I think I'm concerned that we're not going to be able to tackle our work plan if we remove that study session.
Sorry, I wasn't going to talk about that one. So.
Oh, okay, so.
I thought we scrolled past that.
Councilmember Ross?
Yeah, I agree with 100% of what Deputy Mayor said.
Okay, anybody else want to speak on that? Okay, I'm going to speak on that because I completely disagree. I think that the more time we give ourselves, the more time we're going to waste, as we have done this evening.
Case in point.
Case and point made. So I very much disagree with it. I think we make it that point, meeting after meeting. I think that we'd be better off canceling it and then scheduling meetings as needed than we are then to have meetings and canceling if needed. I think that we make better use of our time if we have to schedule a meeting than it is to have the meeting available and to cancel it. That's my opinion. So Councilmember Stewart.
So I agree with you, Mayor. I think in the context of the conversation, right, the idea was we're going to get packet materials earlier, and part of doing that is you guys having fewer meetings to prepare for. And if we get the materials earlier, we can get more of our questions answered offline and be more efficient during the meetings and get through more content. But more meetings, meetings come with a certain amount of overhead for you guys, and so more meetings means you actually, in some cases, get less things done, if I recall the context of that conversation. So maybe, yeah, because we can always call a study session whenever we need one, right? I mean, there's nothing, or a special meeting if we have to, right? So I would agree with the mayor that we go ahead and we remove this. We look to get the packet materials more in advance. We look to make things more efficient. And if we have to, we can always amend the rules later.
Okay, Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, I think just because we're going to get packets earlier doesn't mean that all the council members will read them earlier. I don't read packets until the weekend before the council meeting, so all the material is fresh in my head. I also have other regional meetings and commitments on packets that I have to read, and so we can give them a month in advance, and I'll still read them the weekend before leaving my questions to the end, unfortunately. So.
So I guess just when we come back next week, would it be best that we have like several options for these things again? Or, because I feel like, I don't know what we come back with at this point, right? Because there's different, keep it, don't keep it.
Come back with it, we're just gonna have to vote on it.
So just come back with the way it is, or?
Well, if there's other suggestions on the other one, I think then there's suggestions on this one as well, because it's not going to be a consent item.
So then add options to you, for you to consider with the next one?
Okay, moving on to departmental work program updates. Do we have anything on that? 4.1.3.
Hold on, sorry, I had one for section 3.2.3 that was missed. We had talked about.
Which one do you have?
So it's not in the matrix, but we had talked about it at the retreat, which was that if an emergency meeting was going to be scheduled or called, that every effort needed to be made to reach out to all of the council members for scheduling that before it was scheduled and publicly noticed. So right now, as it reads, a special meeting can be scheduled, publicly noticed, and the council members only need to be given 24 hours notice. And so we all agreed that we would make it every effort to notify council members and schedule for the majority of the council members before that meeting was scheduled and noticed.
Do you have a comment on this one? Councilmember Ross?
Yeah, so many times it is just a 24-hour notice, and if 4 council members say yay, move on.
Well, can at least all 7 council members be notified?
They're required to already.
I'm going to just respond to, because I know why that's being brought up, and I'm going to tell you that that was a mistake of a city manager of the time, because he was supposed to have made those phone calls as promised.
I know, which is why I think it would be good to have it as a rule, because then the city manager has to follow it.
I'm trying to see, I've got a bunch of cities here, and I'm trying to see how they I've written that. Special meetings.
Mayor?
Okay. Councilmember Gamblin.
It says here, each member of the council, written notice delivered to each member of the council at least 24 hours before the time. It says each member, so that means each member gets notified at least 24 hours, right?
Well, it gets an email.
Right. So that's, if it's a special meeting, you're calling it for a reason that is time sensitive. If each person is notified 24 hours, then that satisfies the requirement that everybody know the meeting is occurring. Now, if 4 people can make it, we're on.
That's not what I'm requesting. So if this is publicly noticed 4 days before the special meeting and I only have to be notified 24 hours in advance, that's counterintuitive. So there was a special meeting called that was publicly noticed before all of the council members were even notified. So I want to have a rule so that a city manager can't schedule and publicly notice a meeting without all of the council members having been notified ahead of time. Right? So I'm not asking for anything special other than we reach out to the council before we tell the public there's a meeting. I should not be finding out I have a council meeting on Facebook, which is what happened.
So you want a notification before the notification?
I want a notification before it's publicly noticed.
What if we only have 25 hours?
Dude.
Notification out.
Okay. An attempt should be made to reach each council member. I mean, there's got to be something in that.
Yes, I don't think that that's an
Before publicly
Before-
noticing.
Well, I
Yes,
actually
before
requested
publicly.
that before scheduling, that every effort be made to reach out to the council members before scheduling. I don't think that's an unreasonable request.
I don't know if it is, well, I don't care if it's before scheduling or before noticing, but I think that it should be,
Well, it would be nice to be before scheduling because it happened to be when my daughter had surgery. So had somebody reached out, we could have scheduled it not when she had surgery, right?
does anybody? Yeah, all right.
Yes.
Can you find some words to,
That's easy enough to add.
thank you. Okay, going to, we did 4.1.3, 4.3.2. Moving on. 4.3.9. 4.3.4. 4.4.1. 5.1. Teleconferencing, I know. And agenda materials publication. Okay.
Yep.
Moving on. All right. And information sharing, I'm going to let Deputy Mayor talk about this one. It's her proposed change.
Yeah, I think it's self-explanatory. It's just so that when council members are having conversations, whether it's with Sound Transit or a legislator or whoever, that we're sharing that information. When some council members hold information and don't share it, it becomes more challenging for the body to execute effective policy. It doesn't have to be in a council report. It could simply be in an email, but I do think it is worth noting those interactions so that we're all on the same page.
Councilmember Ross?
I agree with the spirit of this change. However, for clarity, I think, is it sufficient simply to put bullets of discussion so you can do talk about the meeting on the dais. So your written report, maybe I met with XYZ, we covered these 4 items, and then boom, talk about it. Would relieve some of the administrative burden and also encourage doing the such reports rather than being bogged down with writing for those who don't like to write novels.
Yeah. Quick move.
I'm just wondering what happens when people just don't, because some people are just not going to do that, but I guess it doesn't matter. Okay, moving on. 2.7. Christy, these are your changes. So.
Yeah, I think most of them are self-explanatory. We've had some issues with executive session, and the stuff that we talk about there is confidential, and it needs to stay confidential. I think we need some teeth behind it so that the city attorney's emails smacking us on the hand are not sufficient to stop it. So I want some teeth in it.
Yeah, this addition is from the city attorney's office, and it's a recitation of the law regarding civil penalties associated with violations. That's cited in 4223-050. Yeah, this is related to the city attorney oftentimes being found or being asked to be in the role of an investigator, and that's difficult, for, if not impossible, for the attorney to do because we have an attorney-client relationship with you, which means we cannot take a position that's not in alignment with your issues. And so it's usually farmed out to a third party, if you will, when there's an investigation that needs to take place. And that's what the city attorney is recommending here.
Councilmember Treen?
Yeah, I'm in agreement with this. After our experience already, my first experience, so yeah, if it's a violation, then there should be a penalty, period.
That lead just lit up. Okay. Councilmember Gamblin, followed by Councilmember Ross.
So I think we're looking at something in the abstract here. Thank you. Realistically, with the city attorney indicating that it would be a third-party investigation, who would that third party be investigating? We don't know. Maybe we should have some clarification on that. I agree with the spirit of this 100%. It's just in the realistic application of this, it's just so difficult. You have somebody violating the code here, and they've broken confidentiality. The city attorney doesn't want to touch it, so then we have to find a third party who will actually go and investigate and present, I guess, to the council as a whole. I guess I support this. It's just I have my deep doubts of whether or not we'd ever actually see anything happening from it. It seems pretty far out there, but I do support this.
Can I add a comment just based on having done this for 26 years and knowing, in fact, about violations that occur in executive session? They're very, very difficult to prove, if not impossible to prove. And city attorneys have actually sat down with council members individually and talked to them about the civil penalties associated with violations. And in one case I was involved with many years ago, recommended they seek separate and outside counsel because their interests at that point were not in alignment with the remaining council members. Short of that, I think it would be very, very difficult to implement a process that would actually work.
Okay, so we've got Councilmember Ritchie.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate the spirit of this. I guess I'm trying to figure out when we do, well, two things. One, I would ask us to kind of pause for a second here and institute some sort of process based on what the city attorney's note here is that would say when there is an accusation made, X, Y, and Z happen. That's not illustrated here. I don't know what that would look like, but I would definitely think that that would be appropriate if we're going to hire outside counsel to investigate a purported breach of confidentiality from the executive session. Then we would need to have a process in place. We don't. This is not what this is. It just says there's a fine and a penalty, and that's fine. You know, I'm not opposed to the fine or the penalty. I guess I just want to make sure that there's some sort of open, transparent process that we all agree to, or a majority agrees to have that go on. The second thing is I question, just overarchingly, you know, what the result is. I mean, if the goal here is to try to keep what conversations go on in executive session confidential, so be it. You know, that's fine, and I appreciate that. But, you know, a civil $500 fine, that's part of the RCW. So what do we, I guess I just don't understand this is a recitation of the RCW. What are we proposing that's different than the RCW? I'm not quite sure I understand what the change is, unless we have our current, sorry, I'm going off the monitor here. We don't quote the RC. It says revised Code of Washington violations will not be permitted, and the fullest extent of the law. What have we added? I mean, I guess I don't understand the difference between the two, what we do and what we're proposing.
Sorry, the clarification, the column on the left here that I'm circling, that is the language that the deputy mayor had proposed, kind of verbatim. And on the right is kind of what we're recommending if we do want to go with this option. So that's what we've included in the rules.
So isn't that the case already, though? I mean, is there anything in, okay, so.
That's just citing the RCW, you're correct. And I think the discussion on if we want to come up with a policy and a process for how these types of claims get investigated, I think it's going to take a little more time. We wouldn't be able to bring that back with the updated rules next week, but
Might you call that significant work?
I would say that's significant work, yes. So if that's something you want us to look into, it's going to take a little bit more time and effort outside of this rules process.
So that's what I'm thinking, right? I mean, count me into that group if we're going to do head nods or votes or whatever. I guess we are trying to establish a process for enacting an RCW, right? And to the city attorney's point, that has been a challenging process. So maybe it's incumbent upon us to try to build a process around it. We're big boys and girls. We can do that, right? Let's build a process working with our staff to try to figure out how we would create actionable steps, process to enforce the RCW at a council level here in the city. That would be my ask. We're not trying to change the RCW. We're trying to enforce the RCW. But this doesn't speak about enforcement. It just clarifies what the punishment is. So be it. You know, I mean, I think the stuff on the right column doesn't tell me anything. You know what I mean? I appreciate the city attorney's words. I appreciate what the intent is, but.
Point of order. We need to extend the meeting.
Oh, yeah.
I move we extend to 11 p.m.
Second.
Do you have a second discussion? No. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed?
Madam Mayor, apologies if are you done with you all voted, right? I didn't want to interrupt your motion. One other rather unconventional but available remedy that a council has if the council believes that a party has or will reveal confidential material disclosed in executive session is the council does have the authority to exclude a member from executive session.
No. Well, again, how were you going to?
Let's get recognized by the chair.
Okay, so let's go to, I guess we'll leave out the bright lights and bamboo for now.
Was Councilmember
And we'll
Ritchie
go
done?
to,
Because Deputy Mayor interrupted him to extend the meeting.
Councilmember Ritchie, were you done?
Council rules. Okay.
Okay, so let's go to Councilmember Stewart, then Deputy Mayor.
So I would agree that I think if we want to add something, we need to add the process. There's already an RCW. It's already against the law to violate executive session. So I don't know that this adds anything. If we do want to consider that, which is fine, I think it needs to be added to the work plan so that we can assess that in terms of the priorities of everything else we have to do. Because if that is going to take up significant staff time or some amount of staff time, we should look at that in the context of all of the other priorities. And again, I'm not opposed to it. I think it's fine. I think it's a slippery slope if we start saying we're going to vote to exclude council members without having done an investigation and proof. I think that's just going to get really ugly really fast. So I think we should be careful in how we approach that. I think that that should be very judiciously applied. So I would agree with, I think it was Councilmember Gamblin and Councilmember Ritchie, that I don't think we need this rule. I think we need to develop a process.
I wouldn't know what level to start with. Deputy Mayor?
Yeah, I don't think we need a process. I think the intent behind this addition has been accomplished with our verbalization of the fact that there is a $500 fine associated with violating this RCW, and I like the language being in there. It is a nice reminder for the council to remember, and frankly, the emails coming from our city attorney's office, saying you can't violate executive session, don't seem to have a lot of weight, and I think a reminder that it is a $500 fine. And not just that, but it erodes the very confidentiality of that when we go back there to talk about information. There's a reason we go back there. And when we violate that RCW, there is no trust up here. And so I like the language as suggested for the attorney's office to stay in there as a simple reminder.
Councilmember Gamblin.
So I don't actually want to process. I'm happy with this language. I don't want to process. And I actually didn't know about the exclusion. Thank you for mentioning that. I think that's a tool that should be aware, people should be aware of, that if you lose the trust of the rest of your council members, that they won't want you in there anymore, is that's a pretty good indicator that there's a big problem. So that's a nice thing to know. Thank you.
Okay, so we have completed round one. Was that really just round one? All right, Councilmember Ross, round two.
I like the language addition as a reminder.
Anybody else?
Mayor?
Got a light on.
Yeah, I was just reading that. Councilmember Ritchie?
I loathe to do this, but I want to go back to the RCW one real quick, because there was some discussion that the city attorney brought up about excluding council members. If we're talking about reminders, and we're talking about what tools we have in our toolbox, shouldn't that go in here too?
Difficult to characterize it in such a way, I think, to deliver a broad enough but specific enough, that sweet spot, specific but broad enough that you could really find it useful. The specific examples I can give you when people were excluded from executive sessions were individual council members who had either pending or potential litigation against its own body, against the city. And that was an obvious case. I read the report case decisions on this issue and the guidance provided as you having that authority as well if you believe somebody's violating executive session. Finding the language to characterize it in such a way that would be appropriate for your guidelines, we can give it a try if that's your pleasure.
So it's not in the, we're quoting RCW here, right? As far as the fine is concerned, using it as a reminder, I'm digging it. But what are we doing as far as there isn't equal clarifying RCW that
No, the exclusion language that I'm providing here is not in the RCW. It's in, for instance, MRSC's guidance and under the Open Public Meetings Act and executive sessions. MRSC has opined in that manner, and I know that it's been done in practice in some of the cities I've represented.
in those examples that you gave?
In the examples I gave.
Okay, thank you.
Did you want that added as an oldie but a goodie, or? All right. moving forward. Okay. 3.4.1. Nothing. Okay, 3.4.2. Okay, we've got Councilmember Stewart.
Yeah. Is there a way to write this language to address Mary's comments? I do think that we want to make sure that we discourage any sort of disruptive behavior that would intimidate others. But if an audience wanted to cheer for a child, I really don't want to make that against the rules. So I thought Mary had some good points on this one.
Can I just chime in on that? I think that the disruptive or intimidating behavior kind of takes care of that.
Yep.
Deputy Mayor?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I don't think clapping for a child. So anyway, I like Melanie's change there.
Yeah, I like
Yep.
it.
Anybody else? Nope. Okay, moving on. 3.43, 3.44, nothing. Okay, I don't have anything.
Yeah, you do. You have a light on.
Oh, now I do. So, Councilmember Gamblin.
So possibly we can make a declaration. For example, my iPad is continually misbehaving, and I'm having to use my phone as my device. And so, I mean, there may be occasions where possibly a council member can state what they're doing, why they need an exception, and as a kind of just an announcement.
Okay, and actually, I think that's probably a good idea. So if you're seen from the public that you've got a phone out, they probably should know why. Councilmember Ross?
Would it be helpful to just say city provided iPad or city provided cell phone? And I guess declaration's still important because the phone.
Yeah.
Or city iPhone as declared.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
But are they taking our option?
Okay, I don't have any more lights. 3.44, moving on.
Just to clarify, we're looking at the right-hand column here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So we're adding an exception if needed, that the council member will state why they need that exception. And then we're also adding in city-provided iPad or city cell phone.
Correct.
Oh, whoa.
Oh,
No, no city cell phone. I don't know why you need to be on any cell phone up here.
Yeah.
Unless you have an issue like Councilmember Gamlin has stated.
Got it.
Okay, 7.31.
So you've got
Okay.
Councilmember Ross.
Councilmember Ross, followed by Councilmember Stewart.
So I'm on two Sound Cities committees, and I'm representing Sound Cities. And in those instances, a lot of times we're doing real-time votes, and I don't always have the opportunity to get the opinion of the city. So I'm assuming that's excluded from this. It's more when we're actually, perhaps on pick is where all 38 cities are taking a position. So I think we just need to be clear on that.
Councilmember Stewart, followed by Councilmember or Deputy Mayor Malchow.
And that's exactly what I was going to say. I think we all understand that when we're on the Sound Cities committees that we are representing Sound Cities, but I think it would be good to write that into the rule so that the public is aware. So if they were to Because sometimes the public actually does attend some of those meetings, that if they were to see us take a vote and be like, wait, I didn't see that, just to clarify that. So I would agree with Councilmember Ross. Let's just write that in as clarifying language.
Deputy Mayor?
Yeah, so, I mean, if we want to write it in, okay, but it says on behalf of the city. When you're sitting on an SCA committee, you are not voting on behalf of the city. You are voting on behalf of SCA. It is different. So when I'm at PIC, I am voting on behalf of Sammamish.
Right.
When you're at your meeting, you're voting on behalf of SCA. So it is different.
Yep.
Okay, any more? Good job.
Just with this one. We're not really done.
The committee to do next agenda item.
Can you just say no to this next item and move on?
No. No, wait, yeah. We got to do committees.
Okay, so next up I have committees.
All right, yeah. Basically, as stated in your agenda bill, tonight we are discussing whether or not we want to reinstate any of the committees that we previously had, create any new ones, et cetera, for this year. You may recall that the council voted to discontinue committees in July of last year and instead discuss all of the topics in front of the whole council. So included in your packet are a list of all the 2019 committees, including how many times they met in 2018 and their duration of 2019. And then we also have charters in the packet. So if the council decides to form any committees tonight, staff would need to bring back any charters for those committees for approval at a later council meeting. So with that, if there are no questions, I'll go ahead and turn it over.
Okay, so taking a look at the committees of which they've listed, we have got the Communications, Finance, Governance, Legislative, Public Safety, and Utility. First, let's address questions that I have here, and then I'll go from there. Councilmember Ross.
Yeah, my first question is to Mike. Is there any of those listed committees that the staff thinks is value added from their perspective?
I haven't surveyed all the staff who participate on those committees, so I can't speak for anyone else. But on my end, I did feel that legislative did provide some helpful guidance as we went through and as bills were coming up. Having those kind of weekly or bi-weekly check-in calls with our lobbyists, I think provided kind of a quicker turnaround. Were they completely necessary? Maybe not, but I think they added some helpful touch points for me. Yeah, I can't really speak to any of the others. Public safety, it met quite often in 2018 because we were working on the police services study at that point. And then in 2019, we were just wrapping up and talking about implementation of the study. And at that point, I think the committee had ended. I guess Aaron was more involved in finance committee, so maybe he can speak to that one. Governance committee only met twice. It was formed in 2018. And I don't know if that one ever had kind of a clear defined purpose set out for it. It was just sort of a committee to develop recommendations. I looked at the charter, develop recommendations that strengthen the functioning of the Sammamish City Council. We were looking at things such as the social media policy. It could cover things like rules and different types of council trainings that committee may recommend. Yeah, so Aaron, did you have any thoughts on the Finance Committee?
Yeah, so as far as the Finance Committee, it's an option of the council if they want to establish those committees to dig deeper into any one of these issues at that committee level, and then it would come back to the council as a full recommendation. So I think we're all familiar, or at least most of you have been familiar with Finance Committee and what they've done in the past years. So committees as a council committee to look at a particular subject in more detail, kind of at a drill down level. Sometimes the committee approach allows that to happen. a little more. I'd say the disadvantage of committees is if that information is redigested then when the recommendation comes forward and you end up covering the same material twice. So that can be the drawback of having a committee and then have the same issues go back to council for full discussion.
Okay, so I have Councilmember Stewart, followed by Deputy Mayor.
I think when implemented properly, committees can be incredibly helpful. I'm not sure we're there at this moment in time based on like just this evening, right? I mean, we had the Human Services Commission went and did a super deep dive on a topic. And I think that we're going to kind of rehash a lot of that. So I'm kind of the mindset that we're not at a point right now where we're ready to have committees. That being said, I think that, for instance, with the legislative, we could set up the calls because we had set those up and noticed them as public meetings so everyone was able to attend. So it wasn't really so much of a committee as much as it was a check-in. And since they were publicly noticed, anyone could attend. I do think the legislative check-ins were really helpful because things move very quickly once the legislative session occurs. But I feel like we rehash everything here anyway. I think even on the Finance Committee, everything that you presented to us, you had to represent to the council as a whole. So I'm not sure that right now it would be productive.
Sorry, Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, my suggestion would be that we reinstitute the finance and the legislative committees for 2020.
Okay, so Councilmember Ritchie, then Councilmember Trine.
Thanks. Real quick, so kind of riffing off of what Councilmember Stewart just said, I think that the committees can serve a purpose, but I definitely think we should look at them as ad hoc, meaning if we get close to, as we get close to legislative session, for example, we should probably set up some calls so that it all doesn't fall to Mike, right? You know, to take the call with the lobbyists and to try to, you know, what do they know what's coming down the pike? We got to talk to the lobbyists and what's going to be in the legislative session. That may be a short-term need, but to have that meeting all year round, I think is not useful, not beneficial, right? Same thing with budget, right? I mean, we have a budget that goes on as we approach the mid-buy or we approach the budget building process. There's a set period of time where that information can be discussed in an ad hoc committee with, you know, Aaron, and we can kind of sort things out. And I think if we run into a communications problem, let's form a committee to talk about it. And the YMCA, I mean, these are things that we have issues that we need to address. Let's address them in the short term. If a committee can't address it in a short term and it turns in kind of like a swirl or just a mess and we're kind of spinning our wheels, well, then we just kind of stop and bring it back to the committee of the whole. But I think having fixed, seated, week or regularly scheduled committee meetings for committees, what are they doing? You know, at what point do they become just kind of another meeting, as it's been said, that just gets rehashed? So as long as we're giving committees specific assignments, hey, let's form a committee to do X. This is going to be coming up in the next 3 to 6 months. Let's, you know, who's got time to deal with this? Who wants it? Who's got some background in this? Boom, let's go. Rather than standing committees that cause more division and repetitiveness. So, thank you.
Councilmember Ross, then Councilmember Gamlin.
So I think the legislative one is a necessary one to resurrect. I think that has been very productive and generated a lot of great results, both from the council members involved as well as our lobbyists. On the Finance Committee, we have a lot of work ahead of us. And at the retreat, I was talking a lot about let's get started now. And I think that would be a great opportunity to have a conversation early on in the process to lay out a strategy. And I'm not sure we just make that a committee as a whole. Any council member that wants to attend it, you know, schedule like a committee meeting, not during late hours, but maybe during the normal committee times with staff and go through that. Because I think we really need to lay the framework for our budget process and do it methodically and smartly.
Okay, Councilmember Gamlin.
Yeah, I wonder if Councilmember Malchow might speak to her statement of wanting to put those two committees back in. Since I'm new, I don't have a lot of experience in that. I'd like a little more input on why she thinks that would be a good idea.
A lot for you, Councilmember, or Deputy Mayor Malchow's next.
Well, I'll tell you what, Councilmember Gamlin, I move that we reinstate the Finance and the Legislative Committee. I just did.
I second it.
Okay, and now I'd like to speak to my motion.
You go.
So I think we need to reinstate the Finance Committee for the exact reasons that Councilmember Ross just stated. We are on a biennial budget year, and we are going to have some interesting decisions to make this year. As far as the Legislative Committee goes, they're well into session now, but I think it's beneficial for us to have a proactive approach to what our legislative priorities will be for 2021, and thereby we need a legislative committee so that we can start having those questions and conversations, not questions, conversations with our lobbyists now, so that we know what we're going to ask for before their session starts, and we can re-engage with our legislators as we did 2 years ago when I was on the legislative committee, and we met right back there. We had an open invite for all of our legislators from the 5th, 41st, and 45th, and all of these committee meetings, regardless, they're all publicly noticed. So any council member can attend. Now, if you're not on the committee, you don't get to sit at the table and talk, but you can sit there and listen and digest it all too. So.
Okay, we have a first and a second, so discussion, and Councilmember Stewart.
So I don't disagree. Again, I think committees, when done correctly, are incredibly useful. But the argument you just made for the Legislative Committee existed last year. And as a matter of fact, we were midway in the process of working with the legislators to come up with the priorities when we killed the committees. I do think that detracted from the potency of the legislative session, and not having that has been important. Saying all of that, if we're not going to allow the committees to do their job, then I don't see. I think Councilmember Ross's suggestion of a council or a committee of the whole makes more sense, because even in those legislative committee meetings that were publicly noticed, the people that called in still spoke. So I think we either go with committee of the whole, or we don't do committees, because I think that otherwise we're just going to rehash everything up here, and that's just going to be a drain on staff time. So I guess I would like to make an amendment that we reinstate the, or that we create the Finance and Legislative Committees, but they are committees of the whole.
I second that.
Okay, we have a motion, first and second on the floor. We have got a amendment on the floor. And now we have to have discussion on the amendment that is on the floor. I'm going to voice my opinion, since I never get to on anything. I'm going to be voting against the amendment, because if I had to pick two committees, it just wouldn't be those two committees. So I do think we should have committees. I just wouldn't pick those two. So that being said, let's go back now for round one of, and this will be to Councilmember Ross.
Speaking on the amendment.
On the amendment.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to make them committees as a whole, because it avoids the risk of a committee representing a path, a strategy that may not be adopted by the whole council. And by giving the opportunity for as many council members who are interested in that process, the opportunity to weigh in and talk about those issues, I think is valuable. We all are going to have different opinions, but we need to fold in as many opinions as we can to be very successful. So I think that's very positive.
Deputy Mayor?
Yeah, I don't have any issue with these two being committees of the whole, but after our discussion on removing the study session, I think we've just added back in a meeting for the committee of the whole, potentially, depending on the month and given subject matter that may be covered under these two topics. So I just want council to keep that in mind if we're going to do committee of the whole. That may be an additional meeting if it cannot be fit into a regular meeting. And I think it's good. It's a good test drive to figure out if we want to break this off to the typical committees and not have them be committee of the whole.
Is there any other discussion?
Call the question.
Call for the question. Okay, so we have got to call first on the amendment. So all in favor of the amendment, say aye.
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 All those opposed, nay. So it is in favor of the amendment. Oh, then we don't have to go back.
Yeah, you do. You still have to do the main
So
motion as
we have to
amended.
do the main motion as amended. And would you go through the main motion as amended? Would you
The main motion now as amended is that we will be reinstating the finance and legislative committees, and they will now be committees of the whole.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
And
Opposed?
opposed, say nay. Nay. And that is a 6-1. All right.
Mayor, may I?
Councilmember Ritchie.
Just in terms of the responsibility for the legislative stuff that puts on you, Mike, as far as getting those update calls. I mean, part of our request, part of our contract with the lobbyists is that they do those check-in calls with us during session frequently and then out of session infrequently, right? So I guess my hope is that you will report back to the committee of the whole now about those calls, either in a written or in a, you've been doing a really good job of that already, but I appreciate that. But just in terms of the ongoing information that we all get, is that something you're comfortable maintaining?
Sure. Yeah, no problem at all.
Thank you.
Deputy Mayor?
Quick question on that. If we're having a committee of the whole for legislative, wouldn't we have the lobbyists called during the committee? I mean, I think that would.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
okay.
what we're doing, and
Okay, I thought he was asking for you to report back on that. I know, but now because we're having it as a committee, the lobbyists would be calling during the meeting. We wouldn't be getting a report back from Mike.
Sorry, I think I misunderstood that.
Sure, yeah.
He's still able to do that, whether or not the call is in a committee of the whole or committee of 3.
Right, if there was information that we needed to share with the council, whether it's a lobbyist call or any other information that we got, we would definitely share that with the full council.
Right on. Thank you.
Yeah, and just a point of clarification, the committee meetings were typically held during the day, which was more convenient for staff. The trouble maybe with committee of the whole is trying to find a time that works for everyone. Do we have any, I guess, suggestions for how we schedule those? Could we still do those during the day and just say this is the time it's going to be? If you can make it, great. If not, we'll update you afterwards, or?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Wednesday would be nice, but
Are afternoons usually better or mornings for the council? Maybe I'll just do this over email.
Yeah, better.
You're usually more awake in the afternoon, so afternoons. Okay, so let's see. We got executive session.
Council reports.
I don't have any council reports on here.
Well, then,
I have nothing. Do you?
yeah. No, I
Do?
I do.
Then I guess we'd better ask you.
Yeah, so it was discussed, it was discussed earlier. I brought it up under the context of the council rules, but I did want to bring up the fact that I have engaged with Chip and Cheryl to coordinate a meeting to have Rob Gannon from King County Metro come out to Sammamish and that being generated from an SCA meeting that I attended, and that that levy that's likely to be on the August ballot. So back in 2014, King County Metro had a levy fail. And because of that, Seattle went out for its own levy, and they basically de-regionalized transit when they did that. This levy that will be on later this year likely will have a heavy Seattle focus, and what I'm hearing is potentially as well as a southern focus. And if we're to have any consideration for something in that levy, we need to ask for it. And it was suggested to me that the best way to ask for it is to have Rob Gannon and some staff members come out to Sammamish and get in a car and drive the bus route and see what our riders have to do, which is go to the Issaquah Highlands Park and Ride or the Bear Creek Park and Ride. And I think what our constituents are asking for is that express bus that was taken away when the 2014 levy failed. I think they want it back. So I did engage with staff about setting that up. And PIC is tomorrow night, incidentally. And the PIC packet has come out. I forwarded that to our alternate. I don't think there's any action on there, but I can forward it to the full council if there's action on there. And PIC 101 is the pre-PIC, which starts at 6 p.m. So if anyone's interested in what the Public Issues Committee is all about, 6 p.m.
Okay, is there anybody else who has dined share? Okay. Okay, so we are going to go to executive session. And this is going to evaluate the qualifications of an applicant for public employment pursuant to RCW 42.30.1101G. Okay, so.
Extend right now?
Yes, we might as well extend.
11:10?
I'd say to 11:15.
11:15. I move we extend to 11:15.
Aye.